Section 4 of the Grim 13. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. The Head of His House by Conrad Richter. I have often wondered whether good old Tim, who did what he did, was sanctioned by God as head of the house of Mast. Tim had always been my ideal head of a house. Kindly, humble, lovable, quaint, dependable as daylight, he ruled over his little 20-foot front kingdom with a rule that I, a neighbor boy, or anyone else, never felt was there until we committed some crime against it, broke one of his rose bushes, or tormented the alley cat. And then Tim's calling us to account was so frank and gentle that it made every boy of us in the square love him like a father. His wife was queen of his little kingdom. When she was on the front porch, I never saw him come up the sidewalk without lifting his hat to her with an elaborate sweep and with a twinkle in his eye. As a rule, he would pause gravely 10 feet away and absurdly ask some respectful question in a solicitous voice perfectly audible to the neighbors for several doors. One time I remember it was, "Beg pardon, but do you think the lady of the house would give me boarding here?" It seems I can still hear Mrs. Tim repeating to my mother, "Oh, Mrs. Connor, it's the pleasantest husband in the world I have." Often today I still see her and Tim rocking disconsolately on their front porch in the throes of the grip. As if it were yesterday, I can hear the old lady's half-sobbed words, "Oh, Tim, nothing tastes good to me anymore." And I can still see old Tim shake his head and hear him sadly say, "No use, Liddy, the sun doesn't shine anymore." They had never had children of their own. That, I think, was the greatest cross that Tim had to bear. But he carried it bravely. In his and Mrs. Tim's old age, they took a nameless baby from their church orphanage and gave it the name of Mast and the first name of Shirk after Mrs. Mast's family. And now as the son grew up, I saw the first evidence that someday there was going to be a question of whether Tim would always be the head of his house. Tim was a well-read man, devouring newspapers, books, and magazines, saving drawers full of clippings that he never had time to read again. But Shirk came from different blood. At the age of 16, he clamored to stop school. Through one of his companions, he secured a job as callboy for the railroad, and he offered $6 a week to Tim just when Mrs. Tim, after a long, hard illness, had died. Tim had doctor bills and nurse bills and undertaking bills and very little money and nothing more than a rented house. But although it was only another cross, he gave way to the boy and did not force him back to school. Tim, I muttered to myself, you must watch yourself if you want to stay the head of your house." For months, I saw Tim's pathetic face. Then I brought pressure to bear in the office of the trainmaster where I worked. Before long, Shirk was advanced to the office job of night crew caller. After the 3rd year, it paid him $60 a month, and before I knew it, he was married. I think Margie married him rather because she loved old Tim than because she loved Shirk. She was one of the sweet, unassuming girls of town. She and Tim had often been comrades on walks and talks. Shirk could never understand her or any other's interest in his father. He didn't seem to see an ounce of worth in the old man. And the older he grew, the less he seemed to appreciate Tim. It used to make me blue to think what an amazing father Tim would have made to some other boy. And the worst of it was that every day now Tim was getting nearer the time when the chances were Shirk would try to put him out of his own house. It was as common a matter as insurance that brought the first clash. At our sitting room window, I had been picking apart the Sunday paper. Through the screen across our narrow alleyway, I heard old Tim's voice in proud admonition. "Now, son of mine, you've come to the time when you must do your figuring on double harness. Go slow for a while on cigarettes and movies and pool, and buy your wife a wedding present. It isn't fair to Margie if you don't take care of her, when you know that the railroad relief only pays funeral expenses." "I don't see much in life insurance except for a big corporation to make money out of a man," observed Shirk. "You don't have any for us to get anything out of when you die." "Shirk!" I heard Margie's voice reproaching him. "That's to my sorrow, son," came Tim's steady tones. "God knows I would buy it today, but though such things are cheap for the age of you, nobody sells it to an old man." There was a little silence, then Tim's voice came firmly. "Tomorrow, son, you will be going downtown to take out $2,000 life insurance. I've read that it would cost you about $20 1,000. I'll pay $120 a year, and you will likely want to pay the other." "I told you I didn't believe in insurance," declared the boy shortly, "much less in throwing my good money away." "If you think that, all right," answered old Tim. "Life's too short to try to change certain metals into gold. But tomorrow you're to go downtown and get $2,000 life insurance, and as long as you put your feet under my table, my son, you're to remember that I am the head of this house." "You may be now," Shirk answered sullenly, "but we'll see about that when I'm 21.
21 or 31, son," old Tim replied. "If I am alive, I shall be your father and the head of this house."
The months went on, and it drew close to the time when Shirk would be 21. Then one day I noticed that Margie had become nervous and sallow. When I questioned my mother, she explained it with one 5-lettered word. And the next day I heard that Margie's young husband was gambling with his job. He had begun to sleep on his desk after midnight instead of staying awake and paying attention to business. Just the night before, Logan, the night train dispatcher, had a hurry call for 2 crews, one for the yard and one for Beltline Junction. It was about 3:00 a.m. He rang long for his crew caller without getting an answer, so he crossed the yards and found Shirk cocked up on his desk asleep. The men said it was only Logan's good heart that had agreed to report it next time instead of at once. I felt my friendship for Tim command me. Much as I disliked to do it, I leaned over the fence between our backyards one evening and told Tim the story. "They tell me since, Tim," I added grimly, "that Shirk has started to cock up again, only now he turns the other way so his head is nearer his telephone bell. It's a bit safer perhaps, Tim, but it's cocking up just the same. If Logan ever catches him again, it will be all over. He'll be queered with the company anywhere, and you know what other chance a boy or man has in this town, especially if it becomes known that the railroad company discharged him."
"I am grateful to you, Wally," said Tim quietly. "I won't mention your name, but after tonight the boy won't sleep on the job again."
He drew himself up resolutely, and though he said nothing aloud, I knew he had said to himself, "I am the head of my house." But Tim was getting old, and the inevitable happened. One night Logan failed again to get a reply from his crew caller's office. He crossed the yard and found Shirk once more asleep on his desk. He had to shake the boy to get him awake. Next morning, Logan reported the case to the superintendent, and Shirk was at once called and discharged. I disliked to go home that evening, and once in the house I locked myself in, but it was of little use. About 8:00 came a knock to the back door, and there was Tim quietly asking to see me. I brought him in and tried to explain what had happened. "You see, Tim, it isn't that the boy went to sleep. Everybody gets sleepy, and everybody knows it's hard to keep awake, and nobody knows it better than Logan himself. But the boy didn't fall asleep in his chair. He cocked up on his desk again, cleaned off all the stuff, wrapped up an old coat for a pillow, and laid himself down as though he didn't have another tap to do all night. It wasn't sleeping at the post, it was premeditated sleeping."
"I understand," said Tim gently. "It isn't that I came over for. I was wondering, would they give the boy one more chance? You remember that Paul had to be struck by lightning before he could become Paul."
"I don't know if they will, Tim," I stammered. "I might try them." I did what I could for the boy. I saw Logan and then had a talk with my boss, Schaefer, the trainmaster. He took me in to see Manx, the superintendent. I told Manx chiefly about the boy's lovable old father and the critical sickness of the young wife. "What sense does he have monkeying with his job when he has a good old dad like that and a sick wife in the house?" Manx demanded savagely. There was nothing for me to say.
"Well," Manx stared at his desk, "we'll give him another chance, but his job's been filled. About the only thing now until something better turns up will be flagging down at Winter Street. Tell him to be on duty down there at 6:00 tomorrow morning." I thanked him and left. That evening I reported my little success to Tim. "Tell Shirk to take the job and not to be discouraged," I told him. "Manx hinted there would be something better for him later. He may even have something in mind now, and may be offering this other job just to try Shirk out." Tim thanked me with such gentle dignity that I felt fortunate to have been able to be of help to such a man. But somehow I had my doubts about Tim being able to manage much longer the insubordinate member of his house. I was still awake that evening when Shirk came home, likely from movies or pool. He came in the sideway. I heard the alleyway gate slam below my open window. In a little while I heard the murmur of Tim's news. Then the boy's voice answered distinctly. "Me go back to the company flagging like a cripple at $25 a month? Not on your life."
"This is only a job to try you, son. The superintendent told Mr. Connor it was," Tim explained.
"I don't care what that fool said. The company got smart and fired me. They can whistle till I come back anyhow, not to flag at a crossing at $25 a month."
"But they wouldn't want you back at all as far as they are caring," said Tim. "It was Mr. Connor who was the kind enough neighbor to ask the superintendent to try you again."
"What do you know?" raged the boy. "You never worked outside the shop in your life. I tell you, it's Logan who wants to see me flagging down at Winter Street so he can come along and point me out as the fellow he had fired."
"You are blind, son," said Tim clearly. "What does Mr. Logan care about you more than to get out of you as much work as the company pays you for? You have never worked hard enough to make yourself valuable to anybody. The railroad company can get 100 others glad enough for every job they have to offer you."
"And I can get 100 other jobs if I want them," declared Shirk. "You'd be the one to make me flag at a crossing when I could be having a decent job at 3 times the money."
"You've always had a chance, son," rebuked Tim slowly. "In the morning I'll ask Mr. Connor to report you off sick for 2 days. That's how long you have to show that you can get another job. A decent one. If you don't get one by Friday night, Saturday morning you start working wherever the railroad company wants you, if it's keeping cows from off the track."
"Saturday morning you'll have nothing more to do with me," returned the boy defiantly. "I'll be of age, and I'll work where I want to, and when I want to."
"A boy may be 31 and still need a head of his house, son," answered Tim quietly.
"If you're the head of the house, why don't you own it? Why don't you make enough money to feed the people in your house?"
Old Tim was silent. I could imagine his wounded eyes.
"Why don't you support your house so I don't have to work if you're the head of it?" jeered the boy. "You, making only $1.85 a day, trying to boss me, you make me sick."
"You have 2 days to find a better job in," said Tim gravely. "Then you and I will see who is the head of the house." Before I was up next morning, Tim had asked my mother whether I would please report Shirk off sick for 2 days. That he, Tim, would explain later. I did as he requested and spent the remainder of the day wondering what means Tim was going to take if Shirk found no job and still refused to flag. I wondered if Tim would try force. I hoped he wouldn't. Shirk was too big, and he was young while Tim was starting to wobble. I resolved to stay close by and give the old man help if he needed me. The evening of Shirk's second day, I sat in our sitting room and tried to read. Though the evening was unusually cool, I had the window raised. Through the screen I could see Tim alone with a light in his dining room, patiently smoking his pipe. Margie was likely upstairs in bed. Old Tim had told Mother early the morning before that her doctor had said that the girl's only chance now was the fresh air, mental diversion, and physical recreation of some sanatorium in the mountains. Tim had mentioned that he was going to try to borrow some money for the trip as soon as Shirk started to work again. I was wondering how much money the old man would have to scrape together and where he would get it when I heard someone coming in through the alleyway. The footsteps echoed dully. By the walk I knew it was Shirk, but it wasn't the walk of a man who had just landed a job. Through my screen I heard the door close behind him. Then I saw father and son confronting each other from across their dining room table. After a moment, Tim turned and pulled down the blind. I was out of it. I couldn't hope to hear through Tim's closed windows, and now the possible danger of the old man began to worry me. I made up my mind to go boldly over and call, but before I was even up from my chair, a shot rang through the loose massed windows and echoed cavernously in the alleyway. Other neighbors heard it too, but I was the nearest. I do not know today whether I scaled the fence or scuttled around by the alleyway, but I remember bursting in old Tim's back door, and I shall never forget that scene in Tim's dining room. The house was anything but wide, and this room, like ours, chopped off for the alleyway extension, was about 10 feet narrow. A few moments before it might have been cheerful. A golden oak sideboard stood against the wall with its glasses and dishes as neatly arranged as when Mrs. Tim was alive. Drawn up cozily to the table were 2 of the half-dozen golden oak chairs. The table was covered with a cheerful red cloth. Beside the white of the few dishes and the yellow of Tim's old pipe, the cloth looked bright red, but it seemed hopelessly faded where its corners dragged the floor beside the rich wine color that stained the face and hair of Shirk. He lay on the carpet quiet, except for an almost imperceptible ooze. from the ugly, dark hole where his hair and temple met. I don't remember what I first stammered to the old man. I only recall a fervent prayer to myself that I might see Shirk get to his feet and sneer familiarly into my face. But, except for the trickle of blood down his temple, there was nothing about the boy that moved. I tried to imagine what had happened. Somehow I had no idea that old Tim had done it until he straightened up from the floor and laid an old blue revolver on the red cloth. I could not help shrinking from him, but I pitied from the bottom of me his dazed gray eyes and shaking fingers. "He said I wasn't the head of the house," old Tim faltered. "I had to show him I was." He drew a breath almost quietly. "I had to show him." "But, Tim, you didn't do it. Not with that." He nodded faintly. "Even in self-defense, Tim. A thing like that. Was he killing you?" "No," said Tim slowly, shaking his head. "I didn't have to do it in self-defense." "Then for God's sake don't tell anybody," I flung at him. "Don't say a word until I get you a lawyer. Don't open your mouth." A moment more in the kitchen and sitting room doorways were crowded with frightened neighbors' faces. Later came the police, and to the first question asked him, Tim replied, "He said I wasn't the head of the house, and I had to show him." "Tim," I whispered in his ear, shaking his shoulder, "for God's sake, keep your mouth shut." The police took him away, and after tearing myself from knotted neighbors, I went down to the railroad and told Logan the story. Logan was tremendously affected and seemed to take some of the blame on himself. He gave me a card to an attorney friend of his named Munson and told me to engage him, that he would pay the bill. The next morning I reported off and was waiting in the lawyer's office before he came in. I found him a ready listener, but when I had finished telling him the case and everything I knew, he shook his head. "I'm sorry, but your old man's got no case at all unless we change his story. A man has no legal right, you know, to kill his son in order to make him accept this or that or any other job." "But there's something wrong somewhere," I stammered. "Tim is one of the finest, gentlest souls in the world. He would never hurt a fly without cause." "What do you mean by cause? There isn't much cause in law except self-defense." "I believe it was self-defense," I muttered. "Your defendant doesn't seem to support you," said Munson thoughtfully. "I think we had better go down and get his version." We readily gained admittance to Tim's cell, and I encouraged him to trust his new friend with everything. "As I am to be your counsel," explained Munson earnestly, "I must know everything just as it happened. It doesn't say that I will tell everything I know, but I cannot and dare not make a defense for you until I am assured that the prosecution will have no vital facts that I don't know." "The only way, Tim," I urged again, "is to tell everything." Tim nodded, and then repeated merely what he had related to me the night before. "You cannot convince me that you used a revolver on your son without more cause than that," insisted Munson clearly. "It's ridiculous. Tell me every step, please, just as it happened." "He was only home a few moments," insisted Tim. "There was nothing more to tell." "But I want to know every word that was said, every move you both made. Don't you realize, man, that you may hang for this if you do not tell me what I have every right and reason to know in order to try to save you?" Old Tim bent forward helplessly. "There was nothing else. If I must hang for it, they must hang me. I am sorry, Wally, for the neighborhood, and for Margie. How is Margie?" "Mother has her over at our place," I told him. "She is not much better." "Wally," Tim leaned toward me anxiously, "before long there may be some money come to her for the poor lad. Will you take it, please, and send her up in the mountains to the best place the doctor can find?" "I'll see that she gets there right away, Tim," I promised him. Before we left, Munson tried again to force some reasonable explanation from the old man's lips, but Tim could add nothing to his story. We gave up at last and went to Munson's office, where he summed up Tim's best defense. Briefly, it was that the boy, Shirk, had resisted Tim, his father, as I had heard him do before, and that old Tim, because of his advancing years, had used the revolver to threaten, and it had gone off against his will, partially turning his mind. In due time the case came to trial. but it was a losing fight with Tim unmanageable as he had been from the first. To his own disaster, and to the frenzy of Munson, he repeated twice to the jury, "My son said I was not the head of the house, and I had to show him I was. I had to show him." The only satisfaction we had was in the fact that the prosecution was able to force no more from Tim than had Munson or I. They sentenced old Tim for life, and as soon afterward as I could, I went to see him. He tried to smile to me as I came in, but it was only a wistful, forlorn twist that threatened every moment to turn to tears. I did my best to cheer him and was glad that I had news. "Mother got a letter from Margie today," I told him. "Margie says she and the baby are getting better every day and will be down to see you soon. She says it was the mountains and nothing else that helped her." "Thank God," muttered Tim, closing his eyes. His lips moved silently. To me, they seemed to form words that could only make strange meaning. "Tim," I demanded, an incredible assumption working in my brain. "What have you known all this time that you haven't told us?" Tim opened his eyes and wiped them tremblingly with the freckled back of his hand. "Nothing, Wally," he muttered. I was sure now that I had struck a trail. I caught hold of his shoulder. "Tell me, Tim," I urged. "Trust me, I'll say nothing to anybody. Sit down. You're weak, man. You're sick." But he stubbornly kept standing. "You promise never to breathe a word till I'm gone?" he questioned closely. "I promise, Tim." I held up my right hand. For a moment he seemed to falter. "Oh, Wally," he sobbed, breaking down and blinking the tears from his old gray eyes. "Did you never guess when you stood by me so hard? The poor, headstrong laddie. He couldn't help it. He came from other stock than we." "Couldn't help what, Tim?" I floundered. "For 2 days he tried for his job, but everybody refused him," pleaded Tim. "He came home that night so blue. The poor soul, Wally. If he hadn't been blue, he wouldn't have done it, before I could get to him. My revolver was in the sideboard drawer, under the red napkins. He knew it, and till I got to him, it was too late." "Tim," I demanded of him, amazed, "why have you been lying to us, to everybody, as you have?" Tim's eyes entreated me. "The document," he reminded. "It's written there that if the policyholder takes his life, no money will be paid until it's a year after the insurance was taken out. And for the boy, it was only 7 months. What would Margie have done? I hadn't even $1 to give her to go away, and she had to go." "But Tim, I faltered bewilderingly. "Why didn't you say then that Shirk attacked you, that you had to do it in self-defense? You might have saved the insurance and yourself besides." Old Tim squared his unsteady shoulders and stood gently erect. "I take care of my children, Wally," he said. "The dead as well as the living. I am the head of my house." End of section 4. The head of his house. Section 5. Of the Grim 13. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. The Abigail Sheriff Memorial by Vincent O'Sullivan. The manuscript of this story came to us pen-written. We wonder if its many rejections were due to this or to its unusual quality. It is far removed from the formula story that so frequently takes up space in the magazines of today, but we were unable to discover any line of this masterly pictured bit of life that could give offense to the most delicate reader. The Abigail Sheriff Memorial. Liddy, the mulatto girl at Mrs. Wassman's room house, opened my door noisily. "Say, are you awake?" "No." "Well, here's some mail for you." "All right, put it there," I mumbled with my head under the bedclothes. "What time is it?" "About 3:30. The sun's been shining just lovely all day. Listen, why don't you go out in the sun once in a while? 'Pears to me that what you kind of need, instead of laying there in bed and staying out all night. Mrs. Wassman's getting real mad. Yes, sir." "Tell her I was in as early as 4 o'clock this morning. That will console her." The mulatto gave a good-humored laugh. I heard her singing and banging with a brush outside on the stairs. I was furious at being waked up when I might have had 2 or 3 hours more of unconsciousness. With my eyes closed, I tried to think of nothing, but it was no use. The awakening, the most hideous hour of the 24, had to be faced. I pulled over the chair on which my clothes had been thrown and went through the pockets. 4 cents, a subway ticket, a half-empty packet of cigarettes, and a small, taken-while-you-wait photograph of a girl. Where had I got that? Oh, yes, it was that girl who said she was a model. Her shoulders had been painted by... who did she say had painted her shoulders? She had been on the covers of 2 magazines. I tore up the photograph and threw the pieces on the floor, and then looked for the letter which the mulatto had brought in. Whom could it be from? I hardly ever got letters nowadays. I glanced at the envelope, but when I saw the business address of Abner, the picture dealer, in the corner, I flung it away in disgust and laid down again and pulled the bedclothes over my head. It was, of course, another request from Abner to give him some work that would cover the advance he had made 6 months ago. What a rotten life, I thought. Soon it would be a year since I had touched a brush or a drawing pencil. I had had the beginnings of a sort of renown among certain groups. A few articles even had been written about me in little hole-and-corner magazines. But now there was nothing I was more sick of than art and the chatter of art. Art? I hardly gave a thought to it. I would gladly have put my boot through any picture ever painted if the act would have brought me enough for one really big trial of fortune. I had the conviction that the reason my luck had been so invariably bad of late was that the stakes I was obliged to play were too paltry and also too vital. When you are staking your food and shelter, you are so nervous that your judgment is no longer trustworthy. That is how it had been with me for 7 or 8 months. One glorious night I won 20 times as much as I ever got for a picture, but of late the sums I had to put up were so small that I used sometimes go in terror lest they would refuse me at the door. One night they did refuse me. They said I was a broken-down bum. I walked along a street of private houses wondering what I could do. I was suffering the torments of the damned. I would have taken my vest and shirt off and pawned them, but it was too late to pawn. I would have gone to Abner, gone down on my knees to him, entered into any contract he liked, but it was too late for him, too. What was I to do? It was a hard, cold night, but although I was thinly clad and had not eaten anything to speak of for the last 2 days, I scarcely felt the cold. I must have had fever, for I was shaking and burning all over. I felt sure that if I could get back there, just once for only 5 minutes, the luck would come flowing my way. I could not go back to where I lived. I thought with horror of the bare room and the flaring gas jet. I'll go in the river, I thought, sooner than go back to my bedroom tonight. Just ahead of me a motor car stopped. A footman jumped off and opened the door, and a lady stepped out. It was no decision of mine. I had no time for decision. I was driven by instinct to go up to her. "You couldn't help a poor fellow this cold night?" "Here, you get out," shouted the footman. "Beat it, you dirty beggar." But the lady turned, and seeing a shabby-looking man without an overcoat being hustled by her fur-clad servant, she may have thought that things were not altogether as they ought to be. Anyhow, she paused as she was entering the house. "I'm so sorry for you," she said to me. "Please take this," and she handed me a bill. It was as well she did. If she had refused, I might have plucked her rich coat off her back and made a run for it. I tell you, I was desperate. "Madam's too good to the like of you," said the footman. "If you don't clear off, I'll call a policeman." I turned into the avenue, and by the advantage of a street lamp I looked at the note in my hand. It was probably $1, but it might be 2. It was 10. Whether it had been given by goodwill or in mistake, there it was. And it brought luck that night. I did well. With the proceeds, I furbished myself up somewhat. Heaven knows I hesitated about doing this, but it was necessary. If I presented a fairly decent appearance where I went to play, they would not be so ready to insult me and throw me out. That was the only reason I bought clothes, for I had gradually cut adrift from all acquaintances. And as for the art world that lives in expensive studios and gives receptions and wears dress clothes and looks after its health, I had nothing to do with it. It was always a question with me when I had $1 whether it would be safe to go without food or not. Once I had a kind of fit in that place where we played, and they made things very unpleasant for me. They were afraid I might die in the house, and then the police would come in. So to prevent a recurrence of the fainting fit, I began to eat more regularly. Sometimes I would take what might be called a good dinner, 2 or 3 dishes. Then I would give myself some advice, and go immediately back to my room, resolved to stay in all night. But if you
have only one room, the worst hours to be in it, I think, are the early hours of the night. For if you have only a cheap room to depend on for shelter, and hold that precariously, you have surely had horrible thoughts in it at one time or another, and they are all over the wall. If you find yourself in your room at 9 or 10 o'clock in the evening, a time when you might have a respite, these haggard thoughts come down from the wall and crowd round you, and the anguish is such that only the most heroic spirits can bear it. I never could. The voices in the streets, the lights and noise, called me out of that place of torment. In the streets you have the illusion of sharing the torment with others. It all seems strange to me when I look back on that time now that life has become so gray and indifferent. I ask myself, could that really have been me? I hardly existed till 5 or 6 at night. It all depended on the awakening. If I regained consciousness upon the pleasant thought that I had recovered a good sum from the night before, I might go out, even if the sun were shining, stroll in the park, buy myself a decent meal. In the opposite case, I would lie there supinely, prolonging a comatose state as much as I could, so as not to face the blank, merciless day with all the shifts and expedients and scrawpings and humiliations. As for work, drawing and painting, are you laughing at me? I tried it once or twice, to do what is called commercial work, pictures for advertisements. Even with that kind of thing, I could make no headway. I stared at the paper for an hour at a time, but I was developing a new system of play, a flawless system which was bound to succeed. Well, this day that the letter had come from Abner, I found that I had 4 cents in a subway ticket. Curse it all. It was late in October, but my vest would have to go to the pawn shop. Also the silver cigarette case which I kept for desperate emergencies. I could no longer recall the number of times it had been pawned and redeemed. It had been a good friend to me, that cigarette case, since that woman gave it me with her name, Maggie, reproduced in facsimile of her writing across the cover. I suppose she thought I should always carry it next to my heart. She did not foresee the coarse jokes of pawnbrokers' assistants about Maggie, at which I used to smile in the hope of putting them in the humor to advance a little more. I heard the cuckoo clock in Mrs. Wassman's parlor pipe out 5 and decided to get up, but I lay till about 5:30. Then I dressed, wrapped my vest in a piece of newspaper, and slipped the cigarette case into my pocket. My hat was really too big. Somebody had sat on it last night. As I was studying it absent-mindedly, my eyes fell on Abner's letter on the floor near the torn photograph of the girl. Perhaps I had better see what he had to say. Then I thought it would be only giving myself useless pain to read the letter, and I went out, leaving it on the floor. I had to go uptown, and then across to reach the pawn shop I accustomed. Near Madison Avenue, going toward 5th, whom should I run upon but Abner himself? I kept my eyes down and was for shuffling by, but he hailed me. "Hello, is that the way you treat your friends? Didn't you get my letter?" His tone was cordial. He seemed to be safe and to mean well. I could see no sign in his eyes of the dollars he had lent me. "You look more than usually prosperous, Abner. The picture business must be booming." "Yes, I've struck a good line lately. Modern Belgians, Ensor, Van Meeghem, Rick Wanters. Well, what are you going to do about it?" "About what?" "Why, about what I said in my letter." "The fact is, Abner, I forgot to read your letter." "Well, there it is. I said when I was dictating it that very likely you wouldn't read it. You'll come in for $1 million some day and never know it. Look here," he said good-humoredly, and he took my arm. "Just stroll up 5th Avenue with me, and I'll tell you about the business." As we walked along, he explained that a lawyer had come to see him last week, on behalf of a friend who lived in a remote town in New England. The friend had presented a library to his native place, and desired to hang a portrait of himself and also one of his wife in the reading room. "I thought of you," said Abner. "Like a flash, you came into my head. I said to myself, I'll send him up there. You're just the man, and it will do you good." "Why this unaccustomed philanthropy?" I inquired. "I don't want to leave New York. Besides, I am not the kind of man they are looking for. If there is money in it, and no doubt there is, seeing you have taken on the deal, why don't you get one of those men with the well-advertised names and expensive studios?" "Just because they have the expensive studios," Abner drawled. "There is money in this commission, as you justly remarked, but not enough money for gilt-edged ornaments of art. Do you know that you can't walk into the expensive studios nowadays and say you want a thing done at once? Damned if they don't pull out their engagement books like dentists. No, you're the man I want. You've got talent enough, and of course you are much cheaper. We now come to the square at the entrance to Central Park. He pointed to one of the hotels which stand there. Come in here with me and have a drink. We'll make arrangements, and I'll give you some money at once. You don't want to leave New York? Why, it's the very thing for you. I speak as a friend. You look suffering and exhausted. I suppose you can paint still, can't you? How long is it since you tried? Of course, as I have no money, I am not a free agent. I am a slave, I said, like most other paupers. Still, I don't like to have my life mapped out for me by somebody else. What is more, I won't. Let us hear what are your terms. If they are not tempting, you will have to find somebody else to paint your citizens, Abner. He swallowed the cocktail he had ordered. Then he mentioned the fee, which was much higher than I had expected. I'll give you $100 right now, he said, and he pulled out his checkbook. The project, after all, began to take a fairer light. I thought of my mean room with horror, and of Mrs. Wassman with her shrill or tearful demands for rent. Unless I won tonight upon the product of the cigarette case and my vest, I should be driven to sell the pawn ticket, and after that I should be utterly on my beam ends. In any case, this portrait painting would not be for long, and the change to walking out of this restaurant with $100 instead of just my vest wrapped in a newspaper to depend on was too sweet to resist. Very well, I said. Hand over the 100. You'll go tomorrow, certainly? He asked as he tore the check out of his book. No mistake? Haven't you any ready money? He gave me $4. Just write me a line when you get up there. I'm sending them a telegram tonight, and they will expect you tomorrow. He added a few directions, which I wrote down. Then we had another drink and parted. I felt rather dazed. I had eaten very little for some days, and the spirits I had taken went to my head. I found myself about 8 o'clock in the crowd on Broadway, still carrying my vest. A man and a woman got out of a motor car in front of a restaurant, and I heard my name called. It was Jenny Graham, the girl who had given me her photograph the night before. Gee, you look ghastly, she said. Listen, come and be introduced to my friend. She pointed to a man in dress clothes who was standing a few paces away. Then you can dine with us. He's sure to ask you. I'll make him. I have a word for you, I said abruptly. That photograph you gave me last night. It came to grief. I haven't got it any more. But she continued to look at me kindly. Gee, I'm sorry for you, and there's no help for it. No help for what? You're so unhappy, she cried. So unhappy. I don't believe there is another man as unhappy as you. You don't know yourself how unhappy you are. I felt in my coat pockets for Abner's check. Do me a favor, I said. Keep this for me tonight and send it down to me tomorrow morning about 10. I gave her my address. From the door of the restaurant she turned and glanced back at me. She seemed to be still saying, in her voice made husky by too many cigarettes, So unhappy. So unhappy. She sent the check before 9 in the morning. I had come in very late and had thrown myself dressed on the bed. I went out at once to cash the check and came back and paid Mrs. Wassman. That done, I sat in my room with the rest of the money in my hands. I had that peculiar feeling of contentment which comes over a man who is constantly threatened with having the bed plucked from under him, when he has secured himself a shelter for some time ahead. Mrs. Wassman would leave me in peace now for several weeks. Why go away? The sum of money I held was by no means large, but it was enough with which to try certain combinations bound to win. I could see them working out before my eyes. On the other hand, if I should lose, too, all the fee that was to come from Abner. He would get somebody else. What a struggle. 3 times I went downstairs and out into the street and came back. The last time I decided I would not make the journey. 2 minutes later I seized my hat and ran downstairs and made for a streetcar. In the car, I arranged that I would give myself only a minute to catch the train. If there should be people blocking the way at the ticket window, I would be too late, and there was not another train all day. Accordingly, I hung about the streets neighboring the station and then lounged in at the last minute. The ticket window was clear. I boarded the train just as it was moving out. In the train, I sat feeling as if I were drowned. There was a thin whining in my ears. I could think of nothing. The struggle had spent me. The first clear thought I had came in about an hour, and it was that I had not told Mrs. Wassman I was leaving. Such few things as I owned were still in that square, dismal room. Abner's letter and the torn photograph were still lying on the floor. At a town where I had to wait over an hour to connect with another train,
I thought I had better buy a few necessary things. I should have to walk in on those people with a paper parcel for baggage, but it could not be helped. Besides, I did not care. They lived in a good-sized house, standing well back from a little street bordered with trees. Something unfriendly and depressing emanated from the house as soon as you crossed the threshold. If I were a practiced writer, I suppose I could bring the sensation home to you, but as it is, it baffles me to realize it on paper. It was not so much a sensation of mystery as of secrecy. Those who had died in that house, in the 70 years or more it had been standing, had not quite gone away. Something of them remained in the still rooms. At meal times there always seemed to be some other presence or presences at the table besides the master and mistress of the house. The word for them is subdued. They were subdued to the atmosphere of their house, to their traditions, to the naive furniture they sat among. This unprotesting acquiescence in the unlovely was of course to be expected, given the locality. The tradition was the same as that of the British small tradesman, nonconformist in religion and politics, the stock they originated from. Dreary and unpicturesque religion had no doubt in the first place inspired the dreary and unpicturesque surroundings. In a community which had never opened its eyes to any of the arts except literature, and to that only on its unartistic side, the absence of any testimony to aesthetic needs was not surprising. What did surprise, as one glanced about and the lack of any personal touch became more and more distressing, was that they had conceded so far to an unfamiliar spirit as to have their portraits painted. Certainly they were the very first of their family to make this concession. That first night neither of them affected me beyond a consciousness that they were there and that I was their guest. It is true that I felt sick and desperate and sorry to my heart I had come there, and I was unable to study them accurately. But in the days that followed, when I had become more resigned and clear-headed, they remained so antipathetic and irritating that I used to invent all sorts of excuses to be as little with them as I could manage. David Sheriff was null. He struck me as one of the innumerable men who live out their lives without ever realizing themselves. He was president of the local bank, as his father had been before him, and had, by the report of the town, much money. Though beyond whatever pleasure came from the consciousness that he was rich, he got no pleasure or profit of any kind, that I could see, out of his wealth. In our intercourse he always remembered he was paying me. He was very far indeed from that stage of civilization which breeds the patron of artists, who feels himself less the obliger than the obliged. He was perhaps 55, with a lot of loose black hair parted in the middle over a square forehead, protruding at the top, and a plump face, one of the most usual types of American. He had suffered a stroke of palsy 2 or 3 years ago, and now and then his hands trembled violently, and his head nodded a little. It was easy to see that the gift of this library to his native town he regarded as the central event of his career. It was never long out of his conversation. He had not yet got over his astonishment at his own generosity. It seemed even that he was not quite at his ease about this, for he kept talking to justify himself, to prove to himself he was right, that he had not thrown away money on a toy. "Was it your own notion?" I asked one day when I was painting him. From the moment I had set eyes on him, I had decided upon the kind of thing I was going to turn out. Something after the manner of the John S. Sargent official portrait. It was weary work. I had no heart for it, and I was often on the point of kicking my easel across the room. I took a long pull at the coffee I had standing by me. "Did you think of it all out of your own head?" I asked him insolently enough. "Well, no," he hesitated. "It was more my wife's idea." "But your wife's name is Miriam, isn't it? Why do you call the library the Abigail Sheriff Memorial? Was Abigail Sheriff your daughter?" I was feeling all the time that I should like to throttle some of his money out of him, and besides, the plan of his ridiculous library filled me with contempt. But although I put my crude questions roughly, he showed no resentment. On the contrary, he smiled for some reason or other in a deprecating way and looked a little confused. "The fact is, Abigail Sheriff was my wife's sister. She was my first wife. She died. Painful memories." He ended in a mutter. "It was my wife's idea," he said again. I did not feel any active rancor toward this fool. It was mere exasperation. I hardly remembered him when I was not in his presence. But his wife Miriam, Sheriff, I disliked intensely, with that kind of dislike which makes one hate the thought of some persons. She was tall and thin and dark and looked considerably younger than her husband. Her thin lips, pressed close together, indicated a life spent in self-repression and a long habit of silence. When you saw her, what struck you first was an impression of gauntness, the gauntness noticeable in sufferers from consumption, especially if they are tall, and next, in a secondary way, an impression of flame and, so to speak, of frigid rage, as if she moved among the contingencies of life warily, and resented that she had so to move. Withal, she was handsome, with a kind of handsomeness which repelled rather than attracted, and indeed made no effort to attract. She had extraordinary brown eyes, under long lashes, which I could not help looking at, which nobody, such was their magnetism, could help looking at, although they were weary and veiled and somehow quenched, whether from looking out on tedious days or too much weeping. A mole on the cheek near the lips added to the peculiar fascination of the face, by relieving the bitter expression of the mouth. You thought as you looked at her, here is a woman who has suffered much, whose spirit has been outraged and perhaps mortally wounded. You thought that, I say, but you felt no compassion. I even went so far as to fancy that the fine tragic face was an accident of nature, covering nothing more than a soul as shallow and peevish as any of her neighbors. She was often in fits of black silence which nobody dared to interrupt, brooding, despondent, and, as I thought, almost torpid. When she did talk, it was invariably of the town and the people round about. Some of her characterizations were searing and drew protests from her husband. I learned that the inhabitants of the town disliked her, and were dreadfully afraid of her. Me, she seemed to make a point of ignoring as much as she could. She would talk past me to her husband when we were all three together. Even when I looked at her, she always looked away quickly. From some things she said, I gathered that she disapproved of the pursuit of art. All those boys and girls in New York and Boston who are studying painting want an excuse not to do any real work, she said once in her bitter way. I know nothing about art, she said another time. You are like me, I said, in that. You live by it, don't you? No, I can't live by it. Bless you, I ain't got enough punch. You are not serious, she murmured, and she fell into one of her abstracted fits, twining and untwining her slim fingers in her lap while she stared with her dark frown at a point on the floor. I had begun to paint her now, and accordingly she was obliged to speak to me more than she had done hitherto. My intention had been to brush out a portrait of her in exactly the same style as the one I had done of her husband, but I had been more and more struck by that fugitive look in her eyes, that unwillingness to meet my gaze, as if behind the eyes were a hunted soul seeking madly for refuge. This look, so much in contrast to the hard composure of the face, always interested me, especially as soon as I noticed that I was the only person who called it forth. At her husband, and at everybody else, she looked steadily, with impatient tolerance, and it was their eyes which shifted before hers. It weighed with me so much that, after the first sittings, I threw aside my canvas and began again in an altogether different style. I thought to paint something phantom-like, swooning and imprecise, after the manner of Eugene Carrière. Thus it seemed to me I had the best chance of catching the soul, and it was the soul lurking behind those eyes I wanted to draw forth. Now, after I had been working at this for some days, I was puzzled and disturbed by an inexplicable alteration in the picture. I was satisfied with my work, which I scarcely ever am, and during the sittings, while Mrs. Sheriff was in front of me, it seemed to me that I was doing just what I had set out to do, drawing forth her soul. But one morning, when the picture was beginning to take its final shape, I could not believe the report of my eyes when I examined it. This was not a portrait of Mrs. Sheriff I was doing. It was a portrait of somebody else, somebody I had never seen before. It was as if you were to see, after you had written a letter in your handwriting, but upon a subject altogether different from what you thought you had written, upon a subject, in fact, of which you had no cognizance. I was extremely frightened. I feared I was going out of my mind. I looked still more attentively at the canvas, and I fancied I saw a vague look of Jenny Graham, the girl back there in New York. Yes, there was a vague suggestion of what I can only call the forgivingness of her face in the face I had painted. That's it, I thought furiously.
The delusions are beginning. They were bound to begin. Why did I ever come to this damned hole? I had not a sitting with Mrs. Sheriff that morning because she had to go to a funeral. I was very glad of it. I resolved to give up the work and start for New York. The husband's portrait was finished. Abner would have to find somebody else to do the wife, somebody who had not suffered from strain and hardship and disappointment, whose vision was unimpaired. I went out of doors about 1. It was a clear autumn day with a soft and humid air stirring. There was a wood spreading over many miles beyond the town where I was used to walk, or just to lie on my back among the leaves. There the year was dying like a lovelorn queen, yielding herself passionately to death, and I took comfort in those woods, and the dreamy dappled light that was shed there. My mood changed. In truth, that land there is like a woman. It embraces you with all its color and softness, and entrances and lulls like a lost philtre. Lying caressed under its gold and crimson, plunged in its ever-changing, ever-offering beauty, time is no more. You want nothing of the naive and unwise turmoil of the marketplace, content to let the days slip through your fingers like the variously colored beads of a rosary. That is all. To lie close to nature, very close, seeing nothing but the spacious day and the soft low brows of the night, was all I wanted now. I was bewitched by the land. It looked at me, with all its entrancement, so reproachfully. How can you go away? That life back there of a month ago, Mrs. Wassman, the mulatto, the dingy bedroom, the foul air, and the grinding anxiety. What a hideous dream. But also, what a state I had fallen into to paint my portrait like that. It was not that I had lost my skill, because, as I recalled the picture out here in the woods, it seemed to me that I had never done anything so good. But it was a portrait of somebody I had never seen, and yet the husband's portrait had come out all right. It was an honest, workman-like portrait, entirely unoriginal, a shameless pastiche of Sargent, which any public body would be glad to accept with speechifying. But when I thought of the other, I shuddered with horror, and I began to blame the model, that horrible Mrs. Sheriff. My feeling for her now was hatred. I spent the afternoon in the woods. Toward evening, I came upon an opening which gave upon a bay, an arm of the sea. I had been trying to recall as I walked anything special about Mrs. Sheriff. Up to this point I had taken no interest in her, but now I had the vivid interest we feel in anything we hate or dread. I remembered that on the second night I was there I had asked David Sheriff how old his house was, and upon hearing his reply I had said, as a flourish, that in every house which had been standing long, a corpse lies under the hearthstone. He had received this with the usual chuckle which he uttered when anything amused him. But his wife had seemed extremely angry, and spoke hardly another word during the evening. This was plainly the whim of a stupid provincial woman, who looked on any kind of plain speaking as bad manners. What else was there? I could not remember anything. Oh, yes, there was this night it was blowing so hard, and in an excess of boredom I had said inanely that I wondered the entrance door was not blown open. The wind was really pounding on the windows, but Mrs. Sheriff had evidently taken my remark as an insult to her house, and rose abruptly from the table — we were at dinner — and did not appear again. Her husband apologized for her, a little awkwardly, I thought. The next day, when I saw Mrs. Sheriff, I excused myself, and explained that I had not meant to imply that her house was not sound, but she brushed my excuses aside as of no consequence in her frigid way. What a disagreeable woman, I said to myself for the 100th time. I was thinking that now, as I stood facing the bay. Looking seaward, about 2 miles away to the west, were the capes. Between them, the breakers, always tumbling just there, were gleaming. And behind them, the sun was going down. The sky was a blaze of harmonies, wilder lights, such ineffable beauty I had not seen than on that ending day. It seemed as if the light were pouring through a gorge which led on and on to the end of the world into eternity. It was the gate of heaven. It was sheer nature, untarnished by any touch of man. Thus, and no otherwise, must the scene have lain before the eyes of the lonely Indian, when on this day and at this hour, 600 years ago, he stood on this spot and stared at the sunset. Nothing, absolutely nothing, was there to indicate the presence of man.
that is, looking far out to sea, as I was doing. But as my gaze shortened, there appeared on an elevation of the ground, a space clear of trees 100 yards or more in front of me, a woman's figure, standing solitary and black in the intensely clear light of the sunset tide. I knew her at once, both by her unusual tallness and also by something special in her bearing. It was Mrs. Sheriff. She was, as I say, clad all in black. She must have come straight here from the funeral. She had her back to me, looking toward the sunset, and even as I saw her, she stretched out her arms and then drew them into her breast, a gesture of yearning and embrace. Then I saw her drop on her knees, and she bowed down till her head touched the ground. She must have remained nearly a minute in that position. I know it was long enough for me to fear she had died. At last she rose and walked a little unsteadily nearer to where I had lingered, till she came to a tall tree which stood solitary, with its russet leaves touched to something more exquisite by the sunset. She stood gazing for a time at this tree, and then suddenly she flung her arms about the trunk and pressed her lips to the rugged bark. She is a madwoman, I thought. I determined to slip away if possible without letting her see me, but to strike a path I had to move toward where she stood, and the leaves and dead twigs rustled and crackled under my feet. She turned and saw me. She started violently and stood resting one hand on the tree and the other held over her heart. She was evidently astonished to see anybody in this lone place, but in a moment she had recovered herself. She had recognized me, and she came forward without hesitation or reluctance, as it seemed, though she still wavered in her walk. I have already described her, and you picture her as repellent. Certainly that is how she had impressed me, but as she came toward me now in the sunset, I thought I had never seen anybody so beautiful. It was an unearthly beauty. A radiance encircled her. Her face was transfigured. About her lips and in her eyes was a smile tender and welcoming, such as I had never seen before. It was clear that she did not at all resent my presence. I felt that she was even glad I was there. "You saw me at my devotions?" Now that she was close by, I perceived that her eyes were dilated and that she was panting a little from some strange emotion which was too strong for her sorely laboring heart. I muttered ungraciously that I had only just caught a glimpse of her as I was searching for the path. "We own these woods," she said. "Nobody ever comes here except in the middle of summer, and very few at any time." Then, as if unable longer to bear these trivialities of convention, she impulsively seized my hand. "Oh, I am so glad you have come. I have always wished to see you in this place, because I am natural here. I am myself. I know you will understand me. I felt the very first night you came that you understood me, and I could never look at you afterward because I knew you were reading my soul." She paused, coughed a little, and touched her lips with a handkerchief. I thought I saw a blood-stain on it, but it may have been the uncertain light. "I knew you would sympathize with me," she said. "Yes, but how did you know?" "Because you are so unhappy. So unhappy," she cried out in a kind of transport. "We understand each other by that. I love you because you are so unhappy." I plucked away my hand. Her words brought Jenny Graham to my mind, and I remembered the vague likeness to Jenny Graham in my unfortunate portrait. I had Jenny Graham on the brain. She was beginning to haunt me, apparently. Mrs. Sheriff's repetition of Jenny Graham's words vexed me beyond control. I moved a few paces away. But she came up to me and seized my hand again, and put her face so close to mine that I felt her breath warm on my cheek. "Listen, you will understand me. Sometimes I think I'm hanging to that tree yonder, that tree I love, nailed to it with 2 burning nails through the palms of my hands and my face to the west, looking down the bay toward the sunset. Tell me, do you ever think that—" Her eyes were wild and imploring. There was agony in the broken sound of her voice. "She is mad," I thought again. "You are a sun-worshipper?" I said tolerantly for the sake of saying something. She looked at me as if she did not quite understand what I said. Then her expression changed to something like ecstasy. "Oh, the sun! I love the sun. Yes, I worship it. That is the right word. I kneel to it, most of all when it is setting. I think when it is going, if this should be the last time I shall ever see it, if I should die before tomorrow, And then I think that to die means to be merged into all that glory, and it is the greatest happiness. You are not angry because I say these things to you, not angry at all. I have always lived here. I have never been anywhere else. I love the sea, and the leaves on the trees now. I love them, the beautiful things, beautiful for themselves alone. Nobody sees them. They grow more beautiful, and then they die, and nobody has seen them. Sometimes I think they are a little lonesome. That is why I kiss and comfort them. But most times I think that that is the way to be beautiful, only for yourself, to create beauty only for yourself, and care not at all whether it is praised or not. Tell me what you think. I think so much by myself all day long. All day and often all night. I don't know whether my thoughts are right or not, but you can tell me because you sympathize with me. You see my soul. I stared at her, lost in wonder. This spirit so absorbed in a passion for beauty. A far stronger passion than I had myself, perhaps stronger and more disinterested than the passion of any artist living. How it must have starved! What a power of self-repression! What an iron will she had shown to go on living her life in stagnant ugliness, the deliberate elimination of the charm of existence. I thought of her house, how her cabined soul must have beaten against those walls. Your trees, decked for themselves alone, are the true aristocrats, I said for the sake of an answer. I was not thinking of what I said. She looked at the ground with the frown she always had when she was in one of her reveries. All my life I have loved beauty, she said slowly at last. Beauty and love, those are all I care for. I've only been able to find them in nature. I've never been away or seen things. Tell me, should I have found a greater love and beauty than in the trees here, and the sea, and the sunset, and the first star? No, I answered positively. As to love, I cannot speak. But for beauty, you would have found no greater beauty, because the world has no greater beauty to give. Do you think they do not love us? I do not know. You, perhaps, you are nearer to them than I am. I think they are indifferent. She pondered this again in the same way, staring at the ground. Let us go home, she said at length. We walked side by side in silence. I was not inclined to talk, and even if I had been, it was impossible to talk the vulgar gossip of life to this woman. After we had gone about a quarter of a mile, we came upon the trunk of a fallen tree lying across the path. Sit down here, she said. I placed myself beside her on the log, and she threw her arm lightly about my shoulders. Nothing this extraordinary woman did could startle me now. In what way exactly she regarded me I could not tell, but she had established in her mind some kind of comradeship between us. It would soon be dusk. The far shore of the bay was glowing in crimson and orange, with the trees in a black close mass, like a span of velvet below. One star gleamed in the serene air. Far off in the woods a little owl began to cry. In the gathering shadows, she turned on me a face which I could see was quivering with anguish. You are so unhappy, so unutterably unhappy. Tell me, have you ever committed a crime? I tried to laugh. Yes, numbers, I said uncomfortably. Oh, I don't mean faults, sins. They are of no importance. You mean sins, don't you? But I mean a crime, a great crime. Do you understand what I mean? Yes, I think I do. And have you? No. Ah! I do not know what that sigh which arose from the depths of her stuffed bosom signified, whether relief or, shocking as it may sound, disappointment. Her arm dropped from my shoulders. After a moment she spoke again. What did you mean when you said that night, you know, the second or third night you were here, that in every house which has been standing many years a corpse lies under the hearthstone? Do you remember? It struck me very much. What did you mean? What did I mean? I don't know what I meant. I spoke just to... I meant nothing. Listen, shall I tell you what I think you meant? You meant that people do things, perhaps without thinking, that kill other people. Is that it? Yes, something like that. You mean there are many more people who have killed other people than are known? Yes, or than know it themselves, even. We are very lucky if we can get through life without killing anybody. Have those who lived in your house before you never killed anybody? Just think a minute. Have they never discharged a dependent unfairly or in a fit of anger? Perhaps that act eventually killed the dependent, either by rendering him or her hopeless, or in some other way. Did they never leave a man or woman in despair? Did they never nag or humiliate or take unjust advantage? Did they never bear false witness? Did they never put the law in motion to extract the last penny from the poor? Then there are letters that kill. There are 1,000 things that kill. Oh yes, we are very lucky if we get through life without killing somebody.
Or being killed?
She asked in a whisper. There are those that don't kill.
Is it kill or be killed?
No, not that. She jumped up from the log and stood before me in the unreal light, looking taller than ever in her black morning gown. She stretched out her arms full length with her slender hands loosely open.
I want you to kill me, she said.
I shall never forget how she said it. If she had been asking me to love her, to kiss her, she could not have looked at me with greater sorcery.
Kill me,
she repeated breathlessly.
No, don't interrupt. Hear me out. You will do it, I know, because I love you. I've been waiting for you to come so long, and when you came I knew you saw my soul, and I said to myself, when I tell him all, when I explain, he will kill me. Listen, it will be quite safe. I have a private fortune. I will leave it all to you. We shall settle the details. Oh, I want to die. Only those who want to die cannot die. That woman whose funeral I was at today, she wanted to live. I want to die, and I have not the courage to kill myself. But you will kill me, my friend.
I sat there motionless under some evil spell.
You will do it?
She cried, and on her face, which she bent down close to mine, was a smile of wild rapture. I shuddered. I felt that something terrible and yet lovely was brooding over me. Then I pulled myself together and rose sharply to my feet. What strange things you say, Mrs. Sheriff. You have everything to live for. Money and comfort. Your husband will be wondering what has become of you. Let us hurry back. We walked the rest of the way without speaking another word. I was very much shaken. I was convinced she was irresponsible. She was plainly ill and in agonies of wretchedness. I thought I heard her sob in the darkness. But at dinner she was still and frigid as usual. She spoke hardly at all to me, but she no longer avoided my eyes. 2 or 3 times she gazed at me so long and intently that I thought her husband would remark it. I must have had some sympathy with her, as she said, for although I had seen so much misery from poverty, and had endured so much misery myself from the same cause, that I had little pity for miseries which did not arise from lack of money, or were not accompanied by penury, yet I found myself pitying Mrs. Sheriff. I even went so far as to point out to David Sheriff, when we were alone together that same evening, that his wife's health needed care. "Oh, she's all right," he mumbled. "She's been like that for years. There's nothing the matter with her." The next morning, when she came as usual to sit to me for an hour in the loft, which I had chosen on account of the light to work in, she greeted me hardly at all, and seemed more absorbed and restrained and withdrawn from the life around her than ever. Did she even remember how she had been in the wood the day before? It was quite possible she did not. Such outbursts of emotion, I thought, are often followed by a blank. The exhausted spirit can bear no more. Still, watching her as she sat there listless, I regarded her otherwise than I had done on other mornings. I knew now that there were certain subjects she would respond to. Up to this, it had never occurred to me to ask her opinion, any more than the opinion of her husband about my work. David Sheriff, it is true, had shown some interest in his own portrait. What he was anxious about was the likeness. He wanted something that the boys would recognize. He used to stand a while sometimes, looking over my shoulder, like children do about a painter who is painting out of doors. But she never showed the slightest curiosity. She had never glanced at either picture. She submitted to be painted. But I remembered this morning that the impression which a woman with a sense of beauty so developed took from a picture would be worth having. I said something like this to her. She started, roused out of her dream. "My sense of beauty?" she murmured with a wry little smile. "Poor me." I turned round her husband's portrait from the wall and held it up before her. She looked hard at it for a little, not at all like a connoisseur of the fine arts, but as one trying rather to gather some fact or facts from it, as if she were reading a letter. Then she sighed. "It is very good," she said. "Very like. It is also very cruel. You were angry when you painted it. You did it against your will, did you not? As for beauty, it is not beautiful at all. Beauty is not hard like that. There is more peace and repose and, what do you call it, detachment in beauty, I think. That is not beautiful like a tree or a flower. It is ugly like a man at a tea party in a small town. Our town here." I was a little nettled, perhaps because what she said struck home. "I am afraid you are too classic for me," I scoffed. "You are akin to Lessing and Goethe. I hardly dare to show you what I have done with yourself." The picture was resting on the easel covered with a cloth. "You will bear in mind," I continued, "that it is not quite finished. A strange thing has happened to me with it. I have been trying to paint you, what I saw in you, but what has come out is not you. It as a portrait of somebody I never saw, and yet I saw her in you. I have been ill and miserable and poor. Perhaps my vision has become affected, but you can judge for yourself. Look." And I drew away the cloth. I have said that I was trying to paint my picture in the style of Eugene Carrière, that great artist's power of bringing the body to the very confines of life, of catching the twilight between the temporal and the spiritual, of seizing the human frame when it is swooning away and the ghost emerging. I had thought of when I set out to paint this strange Miriam Sheriff. But my work was not a mere imitation of Carrière. That I swear. It was the best picture I had ever painted, or can ever hope now to paint. Mrs. Sheriff seemed at first unwilling to look at it. Then, visibly putting some constraint on herself, she turned toward the picture resolutely. She gave a low cry and pressed her left hand against her side with her habitual gesture. I thought she was going to fall, but she turned away and hurried from the room. Almost before I had time to be astonished, I heard her light foot on the stairs coming up again. She put a photograph in my hands. "Is that the face you saw?" she asked. It was the photograph of a young woman dressed after the fashion of 15 or 20 years ago. She had a handsome face, very unusual, and it was this face I had painted. But in the photographed face there was something sensual, defiant, even sullen, whereas in my picture it was as if the same woman had passed through some purgatory and come forth 1,000 times purified. "It is my sister Abigail," said Mrs. Sheriff. "I never see her like that photograph. I always see her just behind my eyes with that look of forgiving as she is in your picture. That is how she looked a few minutes before she died." She paused and then added quietly, "I murdered her." "For heaven's sake, don't say such a terrible thing." "That face is what you saw in me, as you said just now. I knew all the time you were seeing it and drawing it out of me. I made up my mind several days ago to tell you all about it. I'm going to tell you. Not here in this house." She glanced carelessly round the walls. "Well, no, perhaps not in the house. I'd rather be out in the open. You remember that tree where you saw me yesterday? Go there this afternoon." I was first at the tryst by a good hour. It looked as if she were not coming, and I felt infinitely relieved. I ought to have resisted her impulse to make me her confidant. If she had a tragedy in her life, why should I burthen myself with it? Surely I had enough already to weigh me down. That portrait, what flaw in eye or brain, what casting off from the wharves of life and voyaging into the unpathed seas of the invisible world did that portend? But when, at last, I sighted her in the distance, the forebodings which had been so heavy upon me since morning suddenly appeared idle. Perhaps the reason was that she was not garbed in black, as she had been yesterday, but wore the many-colored costume of a woman who lives in the country and is much out of doors. These healthy clothes, the soft hat she had on, her bright muffler, her rough gloves, and her walking stick, took her out of the isolation in which I had been seeing her, and established a relation between her and ordinary average women of commonplace existence. Her appearance now was so inconsistent with the vision of her making that appalling confession in the morning that I remind myself once more that she must be suffering from hallucinations, and that she had perhaps forgotten by this time why she had brought me there. But when she was drawing near, a little breathless as if she had hurried, I saw the countenance, cold and indifferent, and repelling in advance any attempt at intimacy, which she kept for the town, vanish, really, as if she had cast off a mask, and there came into her haunted eyes a look of even more intense anguish than I had seen yesterday. "You won't be able to worship the sun this afternoon," I said in a trivial tone, attempting to start the conversation. It was indeed a dull, soundless day, with low-hanging clouds. Ever and anon the sun, concealed by clouds, sent forth a shaft of light which was not sunshine. The bay lay glassy smooth, the color of slate. The leaves had lost their color and looked dead and shriveled on the branches, ready to fall. While I had been sitting still there, I had actually heard them dying, a strange dim crackling noise which began, and then ceased, and began once more. I had spoken to her, as I say, in jest, but in her reply was a great solemnity. "I don't think I shall ever be able to look at the sun again, not since I saw what I saw this morning." She meant my picture. "You make too much of it," I said to soothe her. "Abigail, my sister, and I used to come to this place when we were quite little," she went on dreamily. "She used to stand with her back against that tree over there, to see if she was taller than I was. How strange that seems after all this time. She always wanted to be taller than I was. David Sheriff, who is my husband now, used to measure us. He used to cut notches in the tree. I wonder if they are there still. I never thought to look till now. He was our cousin, but much older than we were. I loved David when I was a little girl, and when I grew up I loved him. He loved Abigail, but she cared nothing at all for him. We had not much money then. David's father was well-to-do, but Abigail and I lived with our mother, who was a widow. Then Sister made up her mind to go to Boston and take up business there. It was the best thing she could do if she would not marry David. She was always quarrelsome with Mother, with me too. I don't know just what she did in Boston. Mother used to send her money sometimes. She was cashier in some large store. She got mixed up with a man who was also employed in the store, and he persuaded her to steal money for him. It must have been for him. Then they found her out and arrested her. David was going to marry me. I was so glad, and so was Mother, but when this news came, he hurried to Boston. He stood up in court and said he had always loved her, and that if they would let her go, he would marry her and pay back the money she had taken. They did let her go on these terms, and Sister married him at once. That was like a knife in my side. I had begun to get my trousseau together. Now there was no more hope. What made it worse was that the very first night they came home, I saw that Abigail hated David, though he was crazy about her. She only loved the man for whom she had stolen, and he had disappeared. She was surly and hard and defiant. She looked as she looks in that photograph I showed you. It was taken a few days after they came home. She was unwell. She had a cold when she arrived and coughed a good deal. She didn't seem to care. Soon she had to stay in bed. I went over from Mother's to nurse her. Sister was terribly querulous and unkind to everybody, but especially to David. She accused him of forcing her into marriage and declared that she would never be a wife to him. She got worse, and the thought came to me from outside my head. I remember that quite well. It seemed to enter my head from outside. If she was to die, David would be free. Then one evening the doctor came and said she was much better. She looked better. She was not going to die after all, and a terrible thing came into my head. It was something the doctor said that suggested it. It was a rough winter night with a terrific gale up. I don't think I have ever heard the wind blow so loud since. The doctor gave Sister a sleeping powder and said she must be kept warm. If she gets through this night well, he told us, she will mend quickly. Then he said as he was going that he hoped the windows and doors were strong or the wind might blow them in. I was to sit up all night with Sister. When the clock struck 1, I looked at her. She was sleeping well with her head on her arm. She was very warm and her skin was moist. We were in that room you have now. You know, it almost faces the stairs and the street door. We had padded the cracks in the door to keep out the drafts, for the bed was near the door and it had not been possible to move it. I stole downstairs and opened the street door. Then I went back upstairs and left the bedroom door open and drew the blankets off Sister. The icy wind came streaming into the room. I opened the window to make more of a draft and sat there shivering, hoping it would kill me too. I did not want to live. I only wanted David to be free from the unhappy life before him with Sister. After a while she stirred and began to cough, but she did not wake up. Cough, cough, cough. I hear that often. But she never woke up. About 4:30 I went down and shut the door. If anybody had passed and seen the door open, he would have thought it was the gale, but nobody passed. I came upstairs again and closed the bedroom door and the window. Then something terrible happened. I heard steps coming slowly upstairs. Heavy, deliberate steps like an old man's. Then there came 3 loud knocks at the door. I jumped into the bed beside Sister and covered my head with the blankets. I wonder I did not die from terror. I waited to hear the steps go away from the door, but they did not go away. It was death that had come. Sister woke up and began to cry. She was much worse. When David was up, he went for the doctor, but Sister Abigail died toward nightfall. We had been standing all this time. There was a distorted smile about her mouth. Then she pressed her fingers to her breast and turned round and stood with her back to me. "Perhaps it was not that," I said at last, uneasily in a low voice. "Yes, it was that. The doctor said she must have got a sudden chill." We were silent again for a long time. I could think of nothing to say. At last, wanting to say something, I stammered, You have your husband, the man you love." She turned round quickly. Her eyes were quite dry. The imploring smile had gone from her face. "Yes, I have him," she replied in a hard voice. "You see what he is. That is my punishment." Then she looked at me intently, straight into the eyes. "Now you hate me," she said. "Hate you? Oh, you poor creature." "Then kiss me," she said, "if you cannot hate me." I took her head between my hands and kissed her on the forehead. "Will you kill me now?" she whispered insidiously. "Oh, my God, no." "But you were sent for that. That is what the picture means." "I don't know what it means, but not that. Never think it." "Then goodbye, and forever, my friend, my brother." She walked quickly away in the dusk, and I did not follow her. She did not appear at dinner that evening. She had a headache, her husband said. About 9 o'clock I went up to the loft and cut my picture into strips. I felt as if I were stabbing a living creature. I burned the strips in the stove which was there. Then I came down and told David Sheriff that I had fulfilled the contract for his own portrait, but that I found I could make no headway with the portrait of Mrs. Sheriff, and so I was going away in the morning. "Call yourself a painter?" he said. "Why, she ought to be easier than me. She can sit still, I know that." He chuckled, but he was evidently put out. "I dare say Mr. Abner can find you someone else." "Well, no, I guess not. I guess it's my picture the folks want to see down in that library." He added that he used to do some drawing himself in his young days. "Over there in the woods near the bay, I used to draw my cousins. I used to stand them against a tree and cut notches in it to mark their height." A few months later, Abner showed me a newspaper which he had received from David Sheriff. It was a local paper, and it gave a full account of the opening of the Abigail Sheriff Memorial Library. My portrait of David Sheriff had been much praised by the orators. There was no mention of a portrait of Mrs. Sheriff, and it was said that she herself had been absent from the ceremony, owing to illness. End of Section 5. The Abigail Sheriff Memorial. Section 6 of the Grim 13. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Easy by Ethel Watts Mumford. Big Jim Glaive came slowly out from the yawning door of the East River Electric Power House, stuffing his pay envelope under the flap of his flannel shirt pocket. He blinked at the moist sun of a Saturday afternoon in April, shifted his heavy boots restlessly on the cobbles, and turned to sniff the riverfront smells. Rough pavement led up a steep incline from the runway, disappeared under a stone arch, and eventually tapped the transverse arteries of the city. To the right, the street led straight to a stubby wharf, built to withstand the onslaught of surging currents. In the crowded channel, tugs snorted and churned. Wide-winged sloops and schooners slid, dipped, and tacked. Stately white passenger steamers glided by. Rusty black freighters, showing raw red stripes above the water, nosed ahead like busy hounds on a fresh scent. Barges, out of ballast, threaded together like giant oblong beads, wallowed in the wake of a disgruntled, puffing guide. The wind was strong and salt, savored and spiced with odors of tar and pitch, scents of strange cargoes mixed with the acrid smells of factories. Across the narrow reach of rushing waters loomed the grim prison buildings of the city-owned island, gray edifices giving from behind their barred windows no sign of life in all the moving pageant of pleasure and profit. Jim sniffed the wind, contented in an indifferent sort of way when, once inside his workshop, the call of the waterway got him night and morning. There was always a sullen hunching of his shoulders as day in and day out he turned his back on the lure of the outpath and plodded homeward over the uneven pavements, the rhythm of his step growing ever slower as he neared the 2nd Avenue flat, where Ellen and the kids awaited his return. Today the misty gold of spring hung over the face of the river. Its soiled waters seemed clean and inviting. Big Jim was very loath to leave the roll and swirl and face the grind and jar. He stood so long that the throng of his fellow workers had been engulfed in the shadows under the arch, and he was left alone on the threshold of the shop. "Hi, hey there, Jim! You, Jim Glaive, you old blankety-blank-blank!" And there followed a string of the glowing insults wherewith they that go down to the sea in the ships greet one another. Jim turned, his sullen face brightened. A slow grin pulled his huge mouth askew. "By cripes!" he exclaimed. "If it ain't Wispy Lungan, you old sinner, where away from, you blankety-blank-blank!" And he countered with another string of opprobrious epithets in a tone of unaffected heartiness. The two men clapped hands as giants meet, in a bone-crushing spasm of reunion. "10 year!" bellowed Wispy, who topped his tall friend by several inches. "All of 10 year, you old steer jostler! What you doing down here, hanging on the edge of this here juice factory?" Jim felt suddenly ashamed of his job. His tone was apologetic as he answered, "Work here. Always was strong with the juice, holding down a good thing, too. Wispy, big pay, steady work." "God!" exploded Lungan. "Settled down to a steady job? Go on, how do you do it? I've been around the world a dozen times since the night you was sandbagged in Seattle. What the hell do you see in this dump to keep you here? Chuck it, Jim, chuck it. Say, I got a grand little thing on, and you're just the lad I'm looking for. If you want to fiddle with the juice, I can fix you for that, and deep sea, too. Come along with me, Glaive, and I'll soak out your dried-up hide. You and them shops, oh, hell." Every atom of desire awoke in Jim at the picture the words evoked. He stared at his old bunkmate. What wouldn't he give for the freedom Wispy offered? Yet the routine of his present life had been sweet once. Once it had been as if the storm-battered ship had struggled to snug anchorage in a safe harbor. But ships were made to sail again. Now he was a hulk, rotting at an ignominious wharf where children played. His children. He looked with burning eyes at the former companion of many a rough adventure. The giant frame was unchanged in the 10 years that had elapsed since the Seattle carouse, that had come so near to a fatal ending. But Wispy's face was altered. 2 new scars, one fresh healed, adorned his left cheek. His square jaw was leaner. The furrows between the horizon-searching eyes were deeper. The puckers at the corners heavy, like the mouth of a corded purse. The lines from nose to mouth were gashes, slashed deep by violent emotions and crude dissipation. But about the man was an air of gay effrontery and self-confidence that lent him a certain coarse glamour, a certain rakish attraction. Glaive's gaze traveled down and fixed on his friend's hands. They were huge and rough, calloused white in spots, red as beef at wrist and knuckles. Slowly Jim lifted his own and looked at them. They were grimed by black smears, but in shape and texture they were the hands of an artisan. "Bah!" he said. Lungan slapped him hard on the back. "Well, me bucko, we'll fix them maulers. Couldn't handle a tarred rope now, hey? We all get soft line in port, veer about, and you'll be a man again. Lord, but it's grand to see you. I never found a better lad than you, from Fiji to Tusco Sound. D'yer mind when we went on the rocks in that old hulk of a beef roller and the steers broke loose? Why, man, if I live to be 100, I'll never forget the wallop you fetched that gorin' skewbald with the pen billet. Gosh, it about saved my gizzard. And the typhoon we weathered going down to Chile on the old Mariposa. Do you remember? Some blow, eh? And say, do you mind that Harpa Haiole girl on Maui? Some looker, what? For 2 cents you'd set up housekeeping with that Kanaka, only for me hauling you off. She's married now, to the white superintendent of the Mauna Kea plantation. Reed told me. Frank Reed, you remember? Neiman Company and his Copra hound. Jim Glaive nodded. Memories came crowding, of charging, bellowing steers in the narrow runways of a listing cattle ship, the roar of a waterspout whirling not half a mile from a helpless, wallowing square rigger, the shriek of the coming tornado, wrecks and wrecks, flotsam and jetsam, blows struck and given, aye, and kisses given and implored, black-eyed Hayaka of Maui and Ratu of Tahiti, with their blue Tata and others, and now he was on his way home to Ellen and the children. Mamie and Louie, whining Jane Elizabeth, ailing Bobby, and the squealing, rolling, bubbling, sniffing infant with its eternal whimper and red, puffy lids. A wave of loathing swept over him, of resentment against Ellen. Why in hell was she eternally having the damn kids? And why, if she had to have 'em, couldn't she keep 'em decent? Hadn't he taken pride in his firstborn Mamie, even lugging her around in her baby carriage? Mamie had been a good-looking baby. Ellen was forever slicking her up with ribbons and starch to make the neighbors jealous. 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 His silence evidently puzzled Lungin. "What's chawing here? What's the grouch? Say, come on with me. Come on to the Dock Rat and have a snoot of grog for old time's sake. You sure are a sight for sore eyes." The words, sore eyes, decided Glaive. They brought the baby clearly before him. He knew Ellen would be anxiously watching the clock. She wanted, he knew, to go see her sister in the hospital, but, hell, couldn't he never have a minute off for himself? Christ, what a fool a man was to marry. He fumed, shook himself, threw his disagreeable thoughts into the discard, and turned to Lungin with his slow, stretching smile. "Go to it, you old soused mackerel," he said. "I'm game for a little has-been talk. There's them at home as can wait." Lungin looked at him sharply. "Don't tell me you're spliced," he exclaimed. Glaive nodded. "Uh-huh." He did not dare look at his companion. He knew of old that expression of disgusted mirth. "You boob! You poor ordinary boob! So one of 'em pinched you, did you? The way they hooks on and drags a feller out is worse'n one of them cargo derricks grabbing a bale out of the hold. You simp! You poor simp! I should have stayed alongside of you and saved you, so I should. Hurry along, the drink is on me. You sure do need a little getaway, you poor ordinary simp," he reiterated. "She's a grand good looker." Glaive tried to appear proud and satisfied. The attempt was not convincing. "I don't say she ain't," Lungin came back. "But, Mary, what's the use when you're a live man? Not that I haven't been let in myself. I'm a widder in San Francisco. Got a feller to write her how I was washed overboard from the Powhatan, and there's a wife Nagasaki way. But say, how long's this been going on?" 8 years, Glaive admitted reluctantly. 8 years? 8 years? Why, man, you must be dead. Kids, I suppose? 5 of 'em, said the electrician. Oldest, 7. Youngest, 6 months, both kinds. He laughed grimly. "Whew," whistled Lungin. "Well, it's your life you're living, not mine. 5 kids, and in a city, too. Well, here we are, and after the earful you just give me, I'm needing several pegs of the hard." He led the way through the green-slatted door of a corner dive that hung at an angle over the water. Glaive licked dry lips reminiscently. Ellen kept tight hold of his pay envelope and saw to it that very little went to the Mikes and Jerrys who tended bar in the neighborhood. He thought angrily that he hadn't stood up to a glass and a free lunch since the souse he had acquired on Jane Elizabeth's birthday a month before. Ellen had given him such what for then that he hadn't wanted to. It wasn't worthwhile. What a sight she had looked with her hair in wisps hanging down about her narrow shoulders, the tears dripping thick down her cheeks, her mouth contorted, her lean arm tense, and her red, sud-slicked hand gripping the rolling pin that she shook at him as she croaked with fury. Good looker, he had called her. God, how could any woman let herself go that way? There had been excuse for his infatuation when he had met her. Trim and neat-figured, ripe-cheeked, and with eyes that glittered at you. Yes, she had been pretty enough, and smart enough to hold many a man's eyes and thought. And she hadn't hooked him like a cargo derrick either, though he dearly wished he could blame her for the whole mishap of marriage. But she hadn't liked him at first, was repelled, wouldn't give to his eager love-making, which had only driven his passion the more, till he had made her marry him. Well, she had had it out of him. God, she was even with him now. He clinked his glass against Lungin's with unnecessary violence, a defiance directed at Ellen. His mental processes were wholly personal.
He never for one moment realized the raw, rubbed life of his overworked, exhausted wife. His resentment against her, against the children, against the inevitable ugliness and wear of the crowded home, was the same instinct in the male that forces the wild female animal to drive her mate from her, that her young may be safe. Imaginatively sensitive to the new and strange, he was totally without constructive imagination of the usual. He could enter into no life save his own, and what made that distasteful, he hated. "Drink hearty," said Lungan, and Big Jim Glaive drank. Ellen Glaive sat at the window of her flat, the sore-eyed baby on her knees. For the moment, the place was quiet. Jane Elizabeth and Louis were in charge of Mamie, and Robbie had gone over to the park to play with the Maxwitz children from across the hall. Mrs. Maxwitz, moreover, promised to keep an eye on the baby when Jim should come back to go with her to the hospital on St. Mark's Square. She glanced angrily at the cheap alarm clock on the mantelpiece. Hadn't he no better sense than to take overtime work on this day of all days, when her sister? But overtime was double pay, and there'd be need of the extra money. He couldn't be much longer now. She put the baby down on a soiled pillow, where it promptly bent itself into an arc and began a hoarse, angry wailing. She turned to the kitchen. If she stayed at the hospital, if she should have to stay, dinner must be ready for Jim and the children. She'd send Jim back in good time. Mamie could tend to the serving and could be trusted to know when the stew was stewed. She fussed about the kitchen, anxiously listening all the while for his familiar step on the landing. The baby continued to cry. She shrugged her lean shoulders angrily. Oh, the everlasting grind of it all, over and over again. She fingered a heap of newly washed infant belongings and noted the dilapidation of the little dresses with a sigh. But what could you expect? They had been handed along from one to another of the brood, until now William's inheritance was sorely tattered. There were some of the best ones still in the trunk. Those she had made when she was expecting Mamie, had stitched herself with such excited, thrilling fingers. Yes, and embroidered them, too. Poor William. It was precious little time she had now to lavish, even on his wants. "Might as well use them up," she said aloud, downing the inward protest that wanted to retain the little garments as keepsakes. Keepsakes of what? Of a few happy years? "Use them up," she repeated. "What's the use?" She entered the inner bedroom and turned on the gas. But getting no responsive gleam, she crossed fretfully to the bureau, and taking a quarter from her lean purse, grudgingly fed the meter box. The light blazed up weakly. Then she removed the damaged red plush curtain that disguised the trunk, and lifting the lid, stood looking down at the revealed contents. In one corner lay a neat, crisp pile of tiny clothes. She did not look at them, but at a framed photograph of herself and Jim in their wedding finery. She had taken it off the mantelpiece and thrown it in the trunk in anger, that time that Jim had come home speechless and reeling on Mamie's birthday. The photograph brought back the, by no means unusual, episode with fresh force. Suppose that was what kept him now. He had his pay. "Huh," she sneered savagely. "He'd not dare. Sure if he does." Surge after surge of anger coursed in her blood. She picked up the picture and looked at it with aching eyes. She'd been like that once, 8 years ago. And now, what with childbearing and work, and always more work and less strength to work with, she glanced in the looking-glass over the dresser. She was a rag, a dish-mop, and she was not 30. She glowered back at the photograph, her likeness of 8 years before, trim and trig, with smooth round cheeks and black eyes that glittered, heavy brown hair that coiled and recoiled around her head, and a pompadour that had needed no fluffing. She had paid 25 cents to the hairdresser for fixing it for the wedding, and how well it had held her veil. And her dress, a bought bride's dress it was from 14th Street. None of your made-at-home things. And how well it showed up in the picture, a sharp white shine on each angular fold. And Jim, he was a fine figure of a man, she conceded resentfully. He had not suffered, nor worked his hands off, nor endured bitter weariness, sickness, and pain, and forever the rack of childbearing. He hadn't sacrificed anything, not he. His home was made comfortable for him, and the best of everything was for him. Mended and tended and fed he was, happy as a king should be, and him coming home soused a dozen times in the year, wasting his money, her money, the children's money. How could a man let himself go like that? Hadn't she told him when she said she'd marry him that he'd have to leave the drink alone? Hadn't he bullied her and harried her into marrying?
Hadn't she turned him down many's the time? Ah, well, he was even with her now. He had taken it out of her. A woman was a fool to marry when there's good positions to be had, and fair play, and independence. Would he help her out when he came home? Not he. He acted as if coming home at all was a favor. Would he mind the baby? Not he. Or help straighten the place a bit, or put his hands to a dish, except to eat his fill and quarrel with the food. And if she said a word, sure, it was up and out for him to play pinochle with Max Witz, or go over to the Morris Sullivan political headquarters. Dumb fury shook her at the thought. Did she ever have a moment's freedom? Never. Not even when it was a necessity that called her out, and he all day long outside to himself with plenty of company and all the fun of factory life. Were his hands torn and rough and cracked like hers? No fear. And here she was, shamed with the looks of her own children, hating the young woman in the flat below, flaunting her one clean baby. God. Wait. Just wait till the children come one after another, without rest between. Give her 2 years, 3. Ah, the kill of it all. She'd learn that life's a hell, all right, when you can't live like humans. 5 kids in the pay envelope that thin. Savagely, she gloated over her neighbor's future misery. Work, 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 work. How could anyone keep a brood clean and mending and decent with no help at all? Didn't the man owe it to his wife to help when she'd mothered his children and made him home? She who'd got nothing in return for all her giving except a roof over her head and a crust to eat herself when the children were half fed? And what had Jim Glaive ever given up for her? His gaddin'. Nothing but his gaddin'. And what was there in that? The right to turn longshoreman or tramp. The right to go dirty and sleep on the docks. The right to get poisoned by vile liquor and cussed at by wharf saloon hussies. And here was Saturday night coming on and him not home. There was Maria in the hospital, and the surgeons cutting her that very day, and her own sister not able to get over to be on hand if they killed her. Ellen straightened her bent back, threw down the photograph, and slammed the trunk lid, forgetful of the little heap of clean dresses. The wailing baby gagged and coughed. The gasping breath sent a stab of fright to her heart. Her experiences had been many and terrifying with her sickly brood. She hurried to the front room, caught up the infant, and patted it quickly, crooning the while. Tears poured from its eyes. Its mouth was fixed in a stiffened square from which no sound issued. Then it yelled, choked, and flipped itself like a piece of animated whalebone. The door opened without the ceremony of knocking, and Mrs. Maxwitz came in, wiping her hands on her blue apron. "Say, Mrs. Clave, dot's a bad holler the baby got. Ain't the man home already yet?" "No, he ain't," snapped Ellen, looking at the alarm clock with vicious eyes. "There, there," she hummed, patting the baby's back. "That's the boy." The baby's congested face paled to its normal shade. The coughing ceased. Mrs. Maxwitz crossed to her neighbor's side and looked at the child with sharp, diagnosing eyes. "He don't look just right. I don't think so. You leave him and go to the hospital. Dr. Forbling by and by come to see Maxwitz, Rumax. I show him the baby then. I leave the door open so I hear when he come, your man. I tell your man, you go him by the hospitals. If you want to get back by tenner yet, you better go now." Ellen nodded sullen thanks and handed over the baby. Mrs. Maxwitz laid the infant across her ample front, after the manner of a plaster, and broke into a high-pitched nasal chant, rocking herself from side to side rhythmically as she watched Ellen Glaive throw on a long gray raglan that covered her soiled and faded dress and thrust her feet into rubbers. The soles of her shoes were worn in holes, but she had neither the time nor the energy to go out and buy herself a new pair. With a last look at the slow-simmering stew pot, Ellen turned away, clumped down the narrow stairs to the street, and headed toward the hospital. Her mind still boiling with resentment, she was hardly aware of the soft air of spring or the warm afternoon light that beautified even the city's ugliness. Why were things so hard? Why was the world so hateful? Why were men so worthless and selfish? Why was the lure of youth and spring and that thing called love? Ah, yes, she had known it once. Why was its deadly sweetness nothing but a poison? Why was her man impatient of the children? Why must she keep on having them, since they meant nothing but want and ill will? She did not formulate the 100 questions that beset her. Rather, they seethed, each an impulse of anger, making her cast black looks at man and maid as they passed by in the Saturday evening stir of humanity released from work. Before the hospital, she stopped short, gazing up at its imposing front with a look of frightened awe. She had all the tenement house woman's fear of the institution. Anything like a public building frightened her. Were it court, library, museum, orphans' asylum, or hospital, she was afraid. Each typified strange doings and goings-on that were regulated by unfeeling human machines. To go to the hospital meant death at the hands of doctors, unaccountable even to God, who pried into people's innards for their own pleasure or information. Asylums meant either insanity or the kidnapping of children delivered into bondage. Better death than that. Courts were openings into prisons. Prisons were pest houses of disgrace. She shuddered as she looked up at the gray facade before her, and compelled her unwilling limbs to mount the short steps of the entrance. She had a creeping feeling that she would be set upon from behind, benumbed with gas, carried off to some terrible room and cut open. And Jim, who should have been there to protect her, hadn't come home. She clutched her coat about her and walked down the echoing corridor to the desk, timidly whispering her request for information to the uniformed official. In dazed fear and anxiety, she took her seat in the waiting room. Her anger against Jim and life in general faded before the white-tiled, strange-smelling imminence of death. "Mrs. Glaive?" called a voice. Ellen looked up into cold gray eyes and beheld a young woman in white, one of those iron-hearted nursing women who starve the sick and themselves eat the good pig's feet and stewed tripe brought by anxious relatives. "Your sister is doing very well," the nurse said briskly. "We won't know, of course, for a few days. No, you can't see her. Visitors' hours 11 to 12, Ward 10. She was gone before Ellen could formulate any of the questions that trembled on her lips. Then she fled to the safety of the street, blind and dumb with the horror of those cavernous, destroying wards of the institution. She shivered. If ever it came to that for her, for the kids, no, never, never. What was the river for, anyway? It was big enough for all of them. She stumbled in her haste. Jim, where in the name of God was Jim? "Drink hearty," said Lungan, and Big Jim Glaive drank. He had ceased to count the number of his drinks. The pay envelope had been opened. One bill had shrunk to a few bits of change. The envelope no longer lay secure under the button flap of his shirt-breast pocket, but was thrust carelessly into his trousers. His great frame rested in the chair, relaxed and loose-jointed. His face was flushed, and a little dew of perspiration showed at the roots of the strong, up-thrusting hair upon his forehead. His eyes sparkled. His slow smile was fixed, yet the liquor had not taken full hold upon him. He was perfectly clear of eye, head, and speech, but he had thrown back 10 years. Under the magic of this unexpected reunion, he was again the reckless roustabout, self-confident, jack-of-all-trades of his youth. Responsibility had slipped from him. He was no longer a member of the community, having a stake in its welfare and future. With a shake of his huge shoulders, he had dismissed the whole thing. Group consciousness and responsibility have to be bred in the bone, ingrained in childhood, established in manhood, if it is to exist at all. Glaive had no group consciousness. The responsibilities he had assumed existed only as a hindering harness he had put on, not consciously feeling that he might at any moment throw it off, but with the under-subconscious regardlessness that had never allowed him to accept the yoke and strain at traces and collar. "You see," Lungan was saying, "it's a big deal. Big chances, too. But what's that to men like you and me? We've shipped on munition ships before, haven't we? And sailed with picric acid and bum containers, ain't we? Well, what if this is filibustering? That's none of our lookout, except that we draw down the big pay. And believe me, you and your juice, why, to get an electrician on this trip, one that I'll okay, they'll have to come across. And say, old-timer, what won't we do to one of them tropic jamborees? Ever dance them meringues and Haiti? Say now, call it done, and I'll wise the owners of this expedition that they've got a first-class man, and'll have to pay for him." Glaive hesitated. His eyes on the saloon clock had shocked him with the lateness of the hour, and the recollection of Ellen waiting for him to take her over to the hospital. Lungan saw and interpreted the look. "Cut it, Glaive. Don't let that wife and kids bunk get you. She'll forage along without you better than with you. She'll get on the city payroll, all right. Are you going to spend your life hanging around a skirt? Cut it, I say. Cut it out. What's institutions for, I ask you, except for women and kids? That's what all them boobs up on Fifth Avenue are taxed for, ain't it? Well, there you are. And if you want to send 'em a slice of your pay now and again, what's to stop you? My God, this juice factory stuff of yours, 7 to 5, steady work and overtime, that ain't living, and you know it." Big Jim rose from his chair and shook himself. "Where'll I meet you?" he said. "Meet me?" Lungan slapped his recruit on the shoulder, bodily jamming him back into his chair. "No, you don't. You come along with me. You don't go back and have no riot with your old woman and go soft on me and back out. That ain't the way to do it. Just don't show up.
If I can't hide her till sailing time, then I'm a simp. Just don't show up. That's the dope." A stubborn light came into Glave's eyes, and Lungan was wise enough to cease insisting. "Nope," Jim said. "I ain't going to have no right, not me. But I'm going to leave her what's here." He struck the pay envelope in his pocket. "And I'm going to tell her I'll be out late. If I don't, she'll be over to the factory and jolt up the watchman. And how'd I know she won't find out and follow her? You don't know her. Where I'll meet you." "No crayons across from the canal basin?" inquired Lungan. "All right, I'm going straight there. You follow me as soon as you get loose. Needn't ask for me. My room's right at the top of the first stair. You're a fool to go back to your dump, but you was a fool to ever get into it. And don't you turn soft on me." "I won't," said Glaive, and banged out through the swinging saloon door. Lungan had been right to warn against his return home. It was a shred of decency, of softness that still held and drew Jim, and, once uncompanioned and in the open street, a vague feeling of shame began to nag at him. After all, it was a pretty raw deal to give Ellen. Ellen would miss him. Ellen loved him. But so had many women in the past, and he had left them behind without a thought to haunt him, or a regret for their absence. But 8 years of habit and life are not to be thrust aside thus lightly, and it was habit that drew him now, in this small matter of the customary return at the end of the day, the turning over of the week's pay, even though it was his intention to break away utterly. But as his feet walked on automatically, his unwilling mind was busy. Time had turned his hourglass. The sands were rising the other way. He was his old, irresponsible self again. The call of duty, the very demands of the flesh and blood he had helped to create seemed illusion. Only the future of adventure and danger, of high pay, long chances, and violent changes, was real. He paused before the narrow entrance of the tenement that was his home. On the right, a grocery store spread faded, limp vegetables to the dust of the street, and flowered its fly-specked window display with highly colored posters of food products. A dingy entry led to Maxwitz's cobbler's shop on the left, Maxwitz with whom he played pinochle. Glaive shrugged and sneered. "That's a life for a man, huh?" Across the street, a gaily lettered sign on the second floor declared the rooms the Morris Sullivan Club. Down the street, gliding the drab corner, was Jerry's Saloon. These and the narrow entrance before him had been his life for 8 years. With an uplift of rebellion, Jim's hate of Ellen rushed back to him. 8 years thrown away, wasted. All for what? That ill-tempered, sickly slattern. He drew himself up pridefully, conscious of his great height and bulk, his powerful shoulders and whipcord thews. Yeah, whose fault was it the blamed kids were sickly? Not his, anyway. With a snort of relief, he threw the blame of his actions, past and future, on his forlorn partner. What had made her a sickly slattern, he did not ask himself. She was one, and that was enough. What he was going to do would serve her right, and if the haul was too hard, she could get on the city's payroll. That was what institutions were for. Lungan had said it. Then habit took him bodily and forced him up the stairs. At the door he hesitated. Ellen would raise a row at his late arrival. Well, let her. He could afford to stand it. It would be the last time. The door to the flat opposite opened with a jerk, and Mrs. Maxwitz spoke sharply in a tense, sibilant whisper. "Come by here." Mechanically he obeyed, chilled by something ominous in her tone. "You put us now all in a fine place," she complained. "Look what you gettin', you and your wife. You don't come home and I gotta mind the baby. Like I ain't got enough trouble by me now already. Dr. Forbling come by and by for Maxwitz's rheumac and say your baby got bad sick diphtheria, he say it. See, you got sign on door. Nobody go out, nobody come in, or go to hospital. I don't know. He come back. What for you not come home when you got time? Your wife gone to sister. Now I got her get this and sick for me and my man and my child." "Diphtheria," exclaimed Glaive, a mixture of fury and relief rising in him. "Wouldn't you know Ellen's kids would go and get some damn thing like that, wouldn't you?" his mind was saying while his evil desires prodded. "You got the excuse to beat it and get a good start." Aloud he said sharply to the wailing neighbor, "Look here, Mrs. Maxwitz, you tell Ellen it won't do for me to hang round no catchin' sick kid. I'd lose my job, see. I'll go and get a room somewheres. Tell her she ain't to worry if she don't hear from me, see. They wouldn't keep me at the shops if they thought I was round with nothing like that." I got her stay away. And say, you tell that doctor to keep an eye on Ellen and the kids. And if things get bad, he'll know about the hospitals all right. I ain't no good in this sort of thing. And say, here's the pay envelope. Give her that. He scooped up the small change in his pocket and added it, dribbling into Mrs. Maxwitz's extended hand. Tell her I had to break a bill to pay back a feller I owed. Tell her to talk it over with that doctor of yours. I got her beat it and get a room somewhere. Tell her she ain't to worry. He ran downstairs and out into the street. Gee, that was easy, he exclaimed aloud as he turned the corner and dove into a side street. With hands crammed in empty pockets, head held high, and nostrils that sniffed the evening wind, he turned into First Avenue and began to plod steadily south to Cran's by the canal basin. Easy, he repeated. Dead easy. Easy? Early in the morning, 5 days after Jim's desertion, a policeman pushed roughly through the group of excited people jammed in the hall before the door of the Glaves tenement. Hey, stand back there! Get out, or I'll club some of you! The crowd of frightened women and children fell back, clutching one another as they were forced up and down the narrow stairs by those who scrounged hastily away from the threatening presence of Roundsman Brady, their familiar street corner standby. Mein Gott! Mein Gott! Mrs. Maxwitz's voice was raised in a shriek of appeal. Quick, Mr. Bratty! The policeman set his shoulder against the closed door, brought back his body with a jerk, and landed his full weight above the lock. There was a splintering crash. The inner bolt still held, but through the broken panel a seepage of ominous vapor fouled the already gas-laden air of the passage. Brady coughed, bent low, and again flung himself against the door. It burst inward. With cries of fright, the crowd pushed further back from the noxious fumes. The officer dashed across the room, tore out the strips of cotton cloth that sealed the ill-fitting sash, and jerked up the window. For some minutes he leaned far over the sill while the rush of gas swept by him. Then he turned and looked at the cloth still in his hand. It was the remnant of a baby's dress. The tatters of other tiny garments had been thrust into every crevice of the door and window. "Plug the whole place up with 'em," he said aloud. "Her baby's clothes. Well, that's a new wrinkle anyway." Dropping the torn strips, he tied his handkerchief across nose and mouth and ran into the dark and silent bedroom. He turned off the open jet and raised the single window that gave up the narrow air shaft. Upon the bed lay the Glave children in a row, arranged with care and order, the smallest near the foot, the largest near the scarred headboard. Ellen knelt before them, her stretched arms touching each one of the still bodies, her head fallen upon the child in the center of that lifeless line, self-crucified after what a Gethsemane God alone could know and pity. In a vain search for a living heartbeat, Brady bent over one small body after another. He lifted at last Ellen Glave's stiffened hand and let it fall with a shrug. Then he turned to confront an intruder. Mrs. Maxwitz stood alone in the middle of the front room, braving the still deadly air. She beat her breast with clenched fists. Between each word of her lament, the gas caught and choked her. "Ach, that loafer! That Verndamper husband! It was him that killed her. Das ist murder, I say it. I say it." "Hey, what do you mean, murder?" demanded the law's representative with sudden sharpened interest. The woman continued to stare at the cracked and blackened ceiling and cry her vengeance. "Oh, Gott, will you let him get away mit it? He leave her husband go away. She no want that hospitals get her baby. Those charities the children gets. And for her, I ask it what? Again, I ask it what?" "Oh, cut out that stuff." The guardian of the public peace moved forward and faced the crowd pushing through the door. "He kill her. He killed the babies," the woman wailed. Then with a louder shriek, "And me, I didn't know, and I help him." With a wild gesture of tragic grief, she ripped her thin print wrapper from her throat to him. Me, it was. What loaned her? Ah, quarter." End of section 6. Easy. Section 7 of The Grim 13. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. The Draw Keeper by Wadsworth Camp. The railroad officials, since it was convenient, placed the blame on old Haley, yet they were more justly culpable themselves, for they should have relieved him long before the wreck. Moreover, he was mentally sound when he told his story to the division superintendent,
and begged him to explain its violations of human routine. Doubtless the superintendent understood, but he was a responsible servant of the road, and sympathy for the victims of one's own mistakes is not, unfortunately, an explosive virtue. Haley had been on the drawbridge at Bull Bluff for more than 20 years. He had brought his wife to the swamp-pressed cabin beside the track. There his son had been born, primitively, for the 15 miles to the nearest town. The scarcity of trains and the lack of a wagon road had made it impossible to get a doctor through in time. After that, they had continued contentedly, even in the crowning loneliness of that place. To make life bearable, there was, of course, their own companionship, the magic of their child's progress, and daily a few trains roaring by, as well as boats and log rafts, whose impatient whistling sent them to bend backs and strain muscles over the turn bar. Eventually the steamboats were given a sinister meaning for them. When they had opened the draw and stood leaning against the supports, they would watch these busy craft glide through with misgivings. They would answer the greetings from pilot house or forecastle with prophetic gestures that conveyed an impression of farewell. This state of mind was forced on them tragically enough one night, when the Queen of the River signaled the bridge for the last time. She was the largest boat they saw. She ran only in winter, crowded each trip with tourists from the north, whom she brought to admire and wonder at the desolate, tropical shores of the stream. At her whistle that evening, Haley and his wife ran from their cabin to the turn bar, unlocked the bridge, and began with desperate haste to swing the ponderous draw, for it seemed an honor to clear the channel for the Queen. They never failed to gape. She gave them a feeling of unworthiness, almost of shame, when her great searchlight picked them out and held them exposed to the populous, noisy decks. They experienced, too, a sense of unreality as her brilliant windows flashed by, and they caught glimpses of upholstery, mahogany, mirrors, and well-dressed men and women at unfamiliar pleasuring. That night, Haley remembered. The captain leaned from the pilot house, waved his gold-braided cap, and shouted, "A little slow opening, Haley!" "Have her wide open for you tomorrow night, Cap," Haley called back. The giant was through. The water, churned by her wheels, moaned and sobbed past the piers and among the pilings. Laughter from the decks fought against it for a while, then died away. Haley had frequently had this fancy of the water, had more than once spoken of it to his wife. He mentioned it tonight. "Sounds like somebody crying." His wife shivered, for the night air was cold. Following their custom, they stood staring after the boat until she had swung for the bend, had exposed for a moment one radiant flank before gliding, swan-like, behind the trees. "Sometimes wish I was on her, Tom," the woman muttered. Haley laughed a little roughly. "Not me. If we saw people to talk to, we wouldn't know how to behave." "They're happy, though," she said. "Those that ride on her." "I wonder," he mused. The bridge lights and the tiny gleam from their cabin were depressing after the glory which, a moment ago, had been beside them, within hand's reach. Silently they swung the draw into place, locked it, and walked across the trestle. Later, still wondering about those who sailed on the Queen of the River, Haley saw a pink reflection grow in the sky to the south. It puzzled him because he thought its area too limited for a forest fire, yet there was no house for many miles in that direction. Consequently, he went to bed satisfied that it could be nothing but burning trees and brushwood. When a freight train came through the next morning, he learned the undreamed of, the unbelievable. The majestic Queen of the River lay a blackened hulk on a shoal in one of the stream's widest stretches, and what was harder to grasp, upholstery, mahogany, mirrors, and alas, many, many well-dressed men and women would no longer be seen through her brilliant windows. Haley took his opportunity between trains, and leaving the draw to his wife and child, slipped down to the appalling ruin. To hear of horrors is bad enough. To face them with one's own eyes is often demoralizing. It was years before Haley could drive the things he saw there from his mind. This healing process was unquestionably retarded by his life in the lonely cabin at the end of the bridge. For a long time that sheltered his memory of the cataclysm. Each object in its single room appeared to have allied itself with some grim, tremendous detail. At night, on the draw, it was worse. "I told him I'd have her wide open when he came back," he often whispered to his wife. "He won't come back. She was too big and pretty and solid. It can't be." And sometimes, when he waited for a log raft to crawl through, he would stamp his foot impatiently. "I wish I had never thought that about the water,"
crying. Else I wish these tugboats wouldn't kick up such a fuss. Or through a habit of introspection acquired during his lonely life, he would reach out vaguely with breathless, unanswerable questions. She used to whistle up there by the bend, just about this time of night, along about 10:30. Remember? It echoed off the trees. It was fit to wake the dead. It got us out, and it frightened the birds. You could hear them moving through the woods. All that noise every night. Where's it gone now? It's so still here, don't you listen for it? And the best way those people used to laugh on deck. Remember that? They laughed louder than ever that time. What's come of all that laughing? The water cries. Hear it? Cries just the same. But there ain't any more laughing. That was long past, and many other and more personal changes had intervened. Haley's wife had left the swamp-pressed cabin. This time, too, when it was the saving instead of the bringing of life, it had been impossible to get a doctor through the wilderness in time. Haley's son was 17. While his father had clung to duty, he had stolen rides or walked the 15 miles to town many times. Now he was ambitious to settle there and work. So it was on Haley that the loss of his wife fell with unconquerable regret. His hair and beard were gray. It was at this time that the trainmen began to call him Old Haley, yet he was scarcely 40 years old. He listened to his son's plans and watched his growing restlessness apparently without comprehension. When the boy announced his definite departure, he acquiesced with indifference. "The road will have to give me another hand," was all he said. This, however, the road refused to do. The bridge was on a branch line. The business did not justify such extravagance. They figured for him the average number of times per month the draw was opened. He would not have believed it so few. The Queen of the River catastrophe, of course, had placed a curse on high-class passenger traffic. During the years since, there had been no large boats. In addition, that section was well cut out, so that log rafts were scarce now. Yet it seemed to him that his back and arms ached no less than before. He spoke of the road's refusal to his son. "They say I must manage with you. If I bother them again, they'll throw me out and get some poor family who'll do the work." "Don't ask," the boy said bluntly. "We'll say nothing, and I'll go just the same. Think they'll kick if they find you're here most of the time alone? Nobody'll say a word. Bridge is only a nuisance to them anyway. Haven't raised your wages in a long time, have they? It would cost them more to put a family here than they're paying you. Meantime, I'll do my best to make enough to keep you when you do leave the bridge." There was no defense against this last argument. Besides, Haley couldn't forecast a life deprived of his small wage, and a conscious final exodus from the cabin was inconceivable. So it was arranged, and so Old Haley was left alone at Bull Bluff. That evening, when he had swung the draw shut after the passage of a small freighter, he seemed for the first time fully to realize his new state. The filth of the passing boat's deck had aroused his contempt, and from habit, with a comment on his lips, he had turned to where his wife had always stood. Emptiness. And it rushed in upon him now how empty his life had become. For since she had gone, the boy had stood in her place, had veiled that emptiness. He straightened his back slowly, and looked about him with the eyes of a newcomer. The sun had just set behind the swamp. The rapidity of its descent suggested a fall. The clouds, bulging upward from the trees, might have been steam rising from its extinction in the muddy water, the faint colors playing over them, the reflection of its expiring fires. It seemed impossible the day should ever flame again after that immersion. The river had an appearance of solidity. From bend to bend it was like highly polished steel. The thick swamp pushed to the water's edge on both shores, save where the railway embankment ran white and smooth from the trestle's ends. To the east, the track stretched straight away, but to the west, beyond his cabin, it curved sharply off into the forest. His eyes rested curiously on the cabin, the focus of his mature life. Its front was built against the embankment, but so steep was that it had been necessary to raise the rear of the little building above the swamp on high pilings. There was a window on each side. Over the door opening on the railroad hung a white sign with worn black letters, Bull Bluff Drawbridge. He walked slowly back, gazing with a sense of sympathy at the huge gaunt moss-draped frames of the cypresses, those ultimate symbols of loneliness. After 20 years he was alone at Bull Bluff, and he faced it with the same surprise and dismay. He asked himself, as he had asked in the beginning, how Bluff had crept into the name of such a waterlogged place,
Only yesterday it had seemed familiar. Home. Why had it suddenly assumed a strange and repellent air? He knew why. He walked on more slowly, with bowed head, until he opened the door of the cabin and entered its shadows. When he had lighted the lamp, he prepared his supper on the dwarfish stove. That task, too, had been spared him by his son. His clumsy efforts reminded him that everything now depended on himself, not only his own necessities, but the necessities of the great outside world which each day trusted its swift messengers for a moment to his care. He must light and set the signal lamps on the draw. He must keep the mechanism well greased. Day or night, unaided, he must swing its great weight at the demands of traffic. This responsibility had been light when the future had cradled it. Now, grown to companionship with the present, its vast bulk for the moment crushed Haley. He began to brood upon it. Later, after he had climbed into the bed, unnecessarily and pitifully large now, he recalled that there was no one with whom to share the anticipation of the unexpected, for the routine of railroad and river was often broken in upon without warning. So Haley lay awake most of the night, listening for a signal from train or boat, starting up more than once at the sudden, mournful cry of some nocturnal prowler in the swamp. And Haley's longing was not for his son. The boy's departure had been an incident in the day, but its train of consequences demanded the return of another figure, who had also gone ahead, but irrevocably. In his simple way, he wondered if she, like his son, would try to make a home for him when he should have left the bridge forever. The habit of insomnia grew. Many mornings he left the cabin, unsteady and half-blind from lack of sleep. Yet during the first month his vigilance was rewarded only once. That once, however, Haley was on the draw with time to spare, and he felt satisfied. At the end of the month, his son returned for a few hours. He swung down from the caboose of a freight train one night. Haley was on the open draw, gazing with a stunned expression at the headlight of the locomotive. He did not see his son at first. Suddenly, bending to the turn bar, he began running with bent back and taut muscles in a narrow circle while he closed the bridge. As the locomotive grumbled by, gathering speed, the engineer glanced at Haley, who clung to the railing of his platform. "Must have been a fast boat you let through, Haley, else you been dozing with the draw open." Haley stiffened with an air of pride. "Ever know me to do that?" "Must say I haven't," the engineer called back. Yet Haley had for the first time done something of the sort. He didn't know just what, but he realized he had made a mistake. He stepped back to the ties with painful care. He walked unevenly from the draw and down the trestle. His head was bowed, his forehead wrinkled. He tried to retrace his actions during the last cloudy half-hour. Hey, Pop!" The voice startled him. He passed the back of his hand over his eyes and peered ahead through the darkness. "That you, son?" The boy ran out on the trestle, took his arm, and led him back toward the cabin. "Come on, 93, son?" "Yes. What was the draw open for? I didn't see any boat. Listen." They paused for a moment. "I don't hear anything but 93. No boat been through here the last few minutes. Oughtn't to leave the draw open, Pop. Some of the engineers might take it into their heads to make a fuss. Maybe you figured 93 would be late." Haley didn't answer immediately. When they had reached the planking in front of the cabin, he leaned against the wall and from the shadows looked at his son in the lighted doorway. "Didn't you hear a boat whistle as you was coming through the woods?" he asked in a low, hesitant voice. "The only whistle I heard was us blowing for the draw." Haley passed the back of his hand across his eyes again. The fingers trembled. "Seems you ought to have heard. I was just dozing off. Woke me up. Wasn't very loud, more like an echo. Course I couldn't take chances. I tumbled out and opened the draw. I watched for her to come around the bend." Haley's voice had more life as he repeated, "Course I couldn't take any chances." His son, before he spoke, filled and lighted his pipe. The match disclosed Haley's figure leaning against the cabin wall. "And our whistle, Pop?" the boy asked, in a low tone. "That's it," Haley said, his voice dead again. "I didn't hear 93. Looked up, there was her headlight blinding me from the other side of the channel. Now, wasn't that curious, son? Curious, wasn't it? Mine must have been set on that boat that didn't show up." The boy entered the cabin. Haley followed him with an apprehensive air. He drew back timorously as the boy turned and faced him. "Look at me, Pop." Haley fumbled with the collar of his shirt. "Pop, you ain't well." "Well enough." "What's ailing you?" "Not sleeping much, that's all. Kinda hanker after company at night on the draw. Now that's curious, ain't it?" His son watched him closely for a moment. "Don't blame you for getting lonely, but whatever you do, don't come down sick." "No fair. Never been sick in my life." The boy handed him a cigar. "Brought you some of these." Haley accepted it silently. He arose and crossed to the stove for a match. He walked, as he had come down the trestle, with an unevenness that was almost a lurch. Once his hand went out quickly and grasped the back of a chair. He steadied himself, then, continuing, lighted his cigar. His son studied him, clearly puzzled. "Pop, you ain't been drinking." The old man swung with a flash of anger. "On duty? I've got a record. No liquor on this bridge." But he knew what had prompted the question. He sat down at the table, leaned his head on his hand, let his shoulders droop, and smoked reflectively while his son waited. At last he glanced up and spoke with a perplexed manner. "Not drink. Going around with the turn bar in circles when I open and shut the draw. Ever make you feel queer, son?" The boy shook his head. "Nor me," Haley went on, "till just lately. Going around in circles that way. Sometimes when I come back in here, this little square room ain't much bigger than twice the turn bar. Goes round and round in circles, too, till I can't see the corners. Now that's curious, ain't it? Clears up by and by." He resumed his smoking in silence. The boy said nothing more until the cigar was finished. Then he urged his father to go to bed. "You sleep tonight without worrying about anything. I'll tend to the draw. You get it off your mind for once." Haley was grateful. For the first time in many nights he removed all his clothing before climbing into the pitifully large bed. His son lay on his old-time folding cot in the corner. "Don't you fret, Pop," he called across the darkness. "I'm not going to miss any tricks." But even with this release, old Haley failed to find forgetfulness. Most of the night he lay listening. For what? He couldn't say, yet he lay awake and listened, and the emptiness at his side seemed listening too. His son left early in the morning on the up freight. "I've got to jump her, Pop," he said apologetically, "or I'll lose my job. Can't afford to do that now. You get more sleep and take some quinine. You'll be all right. I'll be back to see you before long." Haley, still in bed, pressed the boy's hand. When the rumble of the train had diminished to silence and the peace of the forest and the river was broken only by the breeze whispering in the hanging moss and the leaves, Haley raised his fingers slowly to his tired eyes. This time he found them wet. But, although his son's departure had brought the tears, it was not for the remoteness of the boy's return that he wept. He sprang up impatiently and drew his clothes on. He stepped from the cabin. The sun had not yet vanquished the mist which hung above the water and wreathed among the trees, giving them an appearance of ghastliness. The chill in the air made him shake. He entered the cabin again and closed the door. The trouble of which he had spoken to his son grew. Frequently after swinging the bridge he had to sit by the turn bar for some minutes before attempting the walk back across the trestle. At times the woods and the river circled about him so rapidly he could not find his cabin in the green silver-shot confusion, could not tell which way to turn to leave the draw. He was grateful for the few revolutions it was necessary to take in the opposite direction in order to lock the bridge, but they were insufficient. His vertigo increased. He began to resent the impatient signals from boats which sent him forewarned to this circular subversion of his little world. The jovial greetings of pilots and deckhands became mockery. They angered. Supporting himself against the rail or the turn bar, he would stare morosely back without word or gesture. Moreover, his insomnia persisted, and during the nights he dwelt upon the fancied whistle that had sent him to open the draw uselessly the evening of his son's return. Always now he listened with a breathless expectancy. He listened until one night he started up at the same vague but imperative sound, the sound he had described to the boys in echo. He lay back. He determined he would not be deceived again. Yet the vague sound of that echo lingered in his brain. It seemed to beat against his eardrums, but from within. Finally he drew on his boots and left the cabin. The usual fog lay upon the water. There was no boat in sight. Still normally one whistling for the draw would not yet have had time to round the bend. Haley hesitated.
He shifted his weight from one foot to the other until the impulse to hurry to the bridge and open it became irresistible. He swung the draw, running with extraordinary haste in his little circle about the turn bar. When the channel was clear, Haley leaned dizzily against the rail, watching. The fog thickened. Birds in the swamp made slow flapping noises, uttered sharp cries as they rose to higher branches. He watched until he remembered 93 was due. He wouldn't be caught like that a second time, so he closed the bridge. As he clung, waiting for the world to solidify again, he turned sharply. He had received an impression of some presence in the fog at his side, but the fog was very thick. He could see nothing. He repeated this experience at irregular but shortening intervals, heard the vague, formless whistle, neglected as long as he could its command, at last ran conquered to his futile task. Once, when he staggered back to the cabin, his eyes chanced on the clock above the stove. Its hand pointed to 10:30. After that he glanced at the clock habitually on his return from these unrewarded labors. The hands invariably made the same angle. Certain objects in the room unexpectedly recalled old associations which he had fancied forgotten. He rearranged these objects, even hid the smaller ones, but their appeal did not abate. He wondered almost indifferently when his son would redeem his promise to see how he was getting on. To be sure, such a visit would be a relief from the only uniform companionship he knew, the birds and the unseen, unknown things that whispered always in the swamp. His son returned after 2 weeks, on a brilliant Sunday afternoon. Haley sat on the planking in front of his cabin. His haggard eyes were fixed on the bend of the river. He shook hands with his son affectionately. In reply to the boy's questions, he said he was well enough. "Except for lack of sleep and things going round," he added. "Walk in and find you something to eat. I ain't coming. Good chance to get rid of the circles, sitting here in the sun." He resumed his smoking placidly. Again he fixed his steady regard on the bend. After the boy had obeyed, he brought another chair and sat at his father's side, asking questions whose answers appeared to satisfy him. With the setting of the sun and the growth of dusk, however, Haley became unquiet. He glanced frequently over his shoulder. Once or twice he started up to sink back again with a sigh. "Ain't opening the drawer any more by mistake?" his son asked. Haley looked around for some moments. When he spoke, he failed to answer the question. "Remember the boat?" "What boat, Pop?" "The boat that didn't come through that night." The boy nodded. "Wonder what that was?" Haley asked thoughtfully. The evening deepened. The trees at the bend to which the old man's eyes still turned became a dim, shapeless bulk. Little by little, the polish left the steel-like water. The water ceased to resemble steel. It assumed the likeness of a black veil strung from the forest, whose somber masses it still reflected formlessly. The old man stirred. He turned to his son. He spoke with wistfulness. "There's a boat been trying to get around that bend. Some time now." His son started. "A boat, Pop?" "Yes, for some time now. Trying awful hard to get around that bend and through the draw. It can't quite make it." He gulped. "Ain't that curious now, son?" And after a moment, "I wonder if it will ever get around." Haley's voice fell to a whisper. "If the draw wasn't open, then." By and by he arose and yawned. "I never kept them waiting much, did I, son? I'm sleepy tonight. Maybe if I went to bed knowing you was here, I might drop off tight." He stepped inside, but he reappeared almost immediately and faced his son with an air of constraint. "That's curious what I said about the boat, but don't think any more of that. That's all it is, curious." He waited. His attitude was tense. At last he spoke with forced carelessness. "You'll look after the bridge tonight?" "Yes, Pop. Don't you worry." "All right," the old man answered. "Only if you hear a whistle from the river, be sure you get the draw open in time. I'd hate for the draw not to be open in time, son." He re-entered the cabin and went to bed, but he slept little. The thought that his son might not hear obsessed him. In the morning the boy was reluctant to go. "It's too lonesome here for you, Pop. But I can't stay. Wish I could. Stick it out a little longer, and I'll fix it so I can get you up to town." The old man leaned in the doorway. "I ain't so sure, son," he said slowly, "that I want to go up to town."
When he was alone, he set about his work dreamily. The machinery had not been greased for some days, so he went over it with minute care, for he wanted the bridge in perfect order, ready to swing quickly. Afterward, he brought out a chair, and taking his accustomed seat in front of the cabin, fixed his eyes on the bend. His view was abruptly shut off in the middle of the afternoon. A shout brought him upright. A heavy freight locomotive was jarring violently by within 4 feet. "Some sleeper, old Haley," the engineer called back. Yet Haley knew he had been awake. His mind could not fathom the experience. Still sounding it uselessly, he opened the draw for a tow of logs at sunset.
"Hey,"
a man called from the tug.
"if you ain't careful, Haley, you'll flop into the river one of these days."
Haley slowly raised his hand in a gesture of anger. He did his best to hold the boat in his field of vision, but he was unsuccessful. It slipped before his eyes in recurrent and widening circles. His failure increased his anger. He shouted back into the green, revolving confusion. "If you ain't careful, one of these days I won't turn the draw for you." And from out the confusion, the man's voice came back glibly.
"You'll be losing your job before you know it, Haley."
When the tow was gone, Haley shook his head at the memory of his outburst. His mind shrank from the man's prophecy. To lose his job after 20 years. It was longer than usual before he could steady himself for the walk across the trestle. During his supper and afterward, those words clung and troubled. When he was in bed, he kept repeating, "You've got to get the draw open in time or you'll lose your job." Unconsciously, his mind reiterated the refrain while he listened, while the emptiness at his side listened with him. It came at last, the vague, formless whistle, like an echo entering his brain. He sprang up. He drew on his boots, chanting consciously now, "Haley, you've got to get the draw open in time." His power to combat the signal finally demolished, he ran out to the track. The fog lay white and thick on the water. The lights of the bridge were dim, unreal. He stumbled along the ties to the trestle. He reached the draw. He placed the bar in its socket. He commenced to turn in his narrow circle with frantic haste. If she should round the bend tonight, the channel must be open. When his task was done, he hung breathless across the bar, while the world, white this time, and torn with reds and greens from the lamps, stormed about him. Abruptly the world became still. Without preparation, he found himself looking straight through the end of the draw at the fog which rolled between him and the bend. And in the white fog by the bend, he thought something whiter grew and loomed, larger, nearer, in the soundless silence of the swamp and the river. Exultation clutched at Haley's throat. His hand gripped the iron bar. "She's making it," he whispered. "This trip she's making it. And the draw's open in time." The scream of a whistle echoed through the forest. "No need to whistle," he muttered. "Draw's wide." He sprang to the side rail. He leaned over to watch the white shape grow. The intensity of his desire brought it swiftly, smoothly, gracefully nearer, to the end of the pilings. He cursed the fog, for it blurred the lights. It veiled the outlines of the boat from beyond the bend. The chalky prow divided the fog, rolled it far to either side, and the boat, its smallest line unmasked for his memory, slipped majestically into the draw. There was no need to look for the black letters on the side. His hand tightened its grip on the damp railing. He was sure the letters were there, arresting in shape, forming 4 companionable yet desolate words. Queen of the River. Higher, above the decks, he knew the captain leaned from the pilot-house window, waving his gold-braided cap. "A little slow opening, Haley." He did not dare look at the captain. His voice rose. It was like a sob. "Have her wide open for you after this, Cap." Indistinctly, he saw the captain wave his hand, but he would not look closer. The white, graceful flank swept by. The cabin windows came opposite, and Haley stared once more through their remembered openings. But the fog had lingered in there. Or was it another vapor? It twisted about the upholstery, the mahogany, and the mirrors, and the well-dressed men and women he recalled at their unfamiliar pleasures were shadowed beyond definition. He noticed now that the water did not moan and sob past the piers and among the pilings, nor was there the accustomed laughter that had always fought that sound. But when the stern came abreast and he glanced up at the populous, silent deck, he saw the laughter there, and he shrank away. Yet he had known all along it must be like that. Haley, following his invariable custom when the Queen went through, turned to his wife with a comment,
Seems like the water ought to cry tonight, but it don't."
"Remember," she answered, "you never wanted to go on her."
"Yes, see, she's clearing now."
"And remember I always said those were happy, those that rode on her."
He nodded.
"Well," she began.
But the queen had cleared. He raised trembling fingers to his eyes. The lids were closed. He forced them open. The fog rolled again. The white night recommenced its incoherent revolutions. Now that his eyes were open, he could no longer see his wife. He reached out for her with helpless, circular gestures. He thought he heard her reassuring voice from the fog. A vast glare blinded him. The whistle shrieked in an agony of sound. Shouts burst at his ears. The turbulent world closed in and crushed him. They found Haley on the draw. He had been struck by a piece of flying wreckage. They carried him to his cabin and placed him on the pitifully large bed. They did this, cursing and none too gently, for the locomotive and 2 freight cars of 93 lay in the channel. Fortunately, the engineer and the fireman had jumped in time so that, except for the old drawkeeper, no one had been hurt. It would, however, cost the road a pretty penny to raise the submerged equipment and clear the channel. Therefore, someone must be blamed. The engineer could testify that Haley had failed to answer his signal. He bolstered this with the assertion that his brakes had failed to hold. There was no reason for the draw to be open. Where was there any boat? So, Haley was chosen for the sacrifice. The division superintendent hurried down on a special engine. When he entered the cabin, Haley opened his eyes. He told the superintendent his story, expecting comprehension. Confident, one would have thought, of some explanation from so superior a fellow mortal. The superintendent could doubtless have satisfied him, but he wasn't ripe for the sacrifice himself. Can't have nightmares," he said a little hoarsely, "unless you're asleep. Asleep on your job, Haley. Might's well own up." But Haley flung his arm over the emptiness at his side, smiled, and said nothing more. End of section 7. The Drawkeeper.